Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's so good to be live once again, and this time we're going to do a little bit of reading and a little bit of political history. How is everyone doing on this fine Tuesday evening? Or, depending on some of my audience members, probably the middle of the night or the morning for you all, but nevertheless, always happy to be here and live with you all. As you noticed, it is Tuesday. There's no Digital Archipelago this week, so instead, I figured I would take the time to do a bit of reading. I've referenced these papers before in some of my Substack essays, and I'm going to read them all out to you because I don't know if there's an audiobook out for this yet for many of our audio friends. I know Skeptical Waves has been a little bit busy with someone else. But Geo is out of town, and then he isn't out of town, but I already scheduled this. But Geo was supposed to go see his girlfriend, and I guess there was some travel issues there, but that's up to him. So instead, we're going to do a little bit of a live reading and go from there. And I'll just say hello real quick. Hi, everyone. Hope that you're all doing well. And we're going to go read through these essays, offer some commentary, and then dig right through it. Good Lord, I'm looking like a mess today. But with that, we'll get started. These are a collection of essays that were written by numerous figures of what was called the New Right in the late 70s and early 1980s. This was edited and brought together by Robert Whitaker. Used to work at the Heritage Foundation. Uh, Clearly did not throughout his later career, but many certain talking points that you are familiar with, we certainly owe to Robert Whitaker when it comes to the political right. And we're going to talk a lot about these essays and how they've aged, why they're important, how much of our own political philosophy comes from these guys, what has not aged so well, and so on. There's a great dialogue in this by one of the essays between college liberal women and then a new right man, and it feels very fitting in this dialogue about what's weird and what isn't. But I'm also doing this because the funding for today's stream is going to go help cover my travel expenses later in September. I have signed up for an iconography workshop, and I've got about an 8-hour drive to get to the location that it's at. I will be working on an icon of Christ in the Theotokos, and I'm excited because I'll be learning under the person who instructed my teacher at my parish. So that's what this is going to be going for, is just making sure that the 8-hour drive, I'm not paying too much out of pocket. Not that I don't have a problem doing that. I am a wagey in the wage cage doing what I can. But hey, you wonderful people help support and keep things relatively cost free. I don't really pay out of pocket for my medication thanks to you guys. And you all make that very well possible. So again, my gratitude is to you all. But with that, I'm going to turn my camera off here and we're going to get started in just a minute here. And we will get started. So let's go down. Before I actually go too further into this, I want to see if I can find my copy of this book because I own a physical copy. Ugh. I know I'm doing that terrible thing about dead air. But for proof, I own one, and even better, I own a signed copy. I have this is my one big political humble brag of sorts. This is that I have a copy, something signed by Bob Whitaker himself. So, and maybe down the line I'll work something up with Sandbatch and a few others on sort of a Bob Whitaker retrospective for those interested on a man who was heavily influential on Sam Francis and others of the political right. But we're going to go get started, and we're going to carry on here. The New Right papers. We'll start with the forward, and we're going to go as far as we can tonight, and I will continue these streams until we are done with all of these papers. So we'll start with the forward, and this is from Bob Whitaker himself. The dangers of disestablishment. The combination of voters which elected President Reagan was not a new one, nor did it spring forth abruptly in late 1980. It consisted of two major elements. The first was the basic Republican presidential vote, about 40%, which has suffered little defection even in Democratic landslides. The second element, which turned the election into a rout, was made up of voters who in earlier days were overwhelmingly Democrats. These former Democrats are largely white Southerners and blue-collar Northerners who, when the focus of the debate between the parties was economic, voted for Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and John Kennedy. But the focus of the political debate shifted in the 1960s, when the Democrats then became social engineering. Thereafter, these voters began to vote for third parties or for Republicans or to stay at home on election day. Social engineering is a massive manipulation of society's structure and values aimed at bringing about desired, quote, social change and the direction considered best by a small elite. Not much has changed there. It is carried out through programs to achieve racial balance, progressive education, discrediting the traditional values and parental authority, the imposition of a new ideology and morality. The opponents of social engineering are fittingly referred to here as social conservatives. From Andrew Jackson to John Kennedy, for over a century and a quarter, the bedrock base of the Democratic Party was made up of white Southerners and Irish Americans. The latter group was joined in its firm loyalty later by immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, who also make up a major portion of the social conservative exodus from the party. He's got an asterisk here, but we can already see just how much has radically changed in the 42 years since this text came out. It's 2024 now. It's been 42 years since 1982. And here we are looking at a dramatically different American demographic. In 1980, when this former bedrock of the Democratic Party pulled out of every electoral level, the party collapsed with a crash heard in that citadel of deafness, Washington, D.C. But through that sound was louder this time, it was not new. As far back as 1968, social conservatives abandoned the ticket led by Hubert Humphrey to vote for a third party bid of Governor George Wallace of Alabama. Governor Wallace received almost 10 million votes, 13.8% of the total, while the winner, Richard Nixon, received the basic Republican support of 43.1% of the votes cast. Added together, these two groups constituted about 57% of the total, more than the percentage obtained by Mr. Reagan when the social conservatives joined with traditional Republicans to vote for him in 1980. Democrats showed their obliviousness to the lesson of 1968 by nominating the all time champion of social engineering, George McGovern, to head their ticket in 1972. He was crushed in a landslide victory for President Nixon, and as the social conservatives unanimously rejected McGovern. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, using the rhetoric of social conservatism, drew a sufficient number of social conservative votes to defeat President Ford. But his performance showed President Carter to be the social liberal elite. The lesson of 1980, and I'll pause there just to read this. This little asterisk here is, of course, referring to ethnics, but I prefer my own term, identity groups, which includes non-quote ethnic groups like mountaineers who are seeking to preserve their own identity against the educational establishment. The considerable number of so-called ethnics whom I have marched and worked also to prefer this term, identity groups. So again, sort of identity politics, or as we sort of just know it, just the racial coalition building that gets used in political parties today. So the lesson of 1980 was the fourth successive repetition of the rule, which should have been obvious to anyone outside of the confines of the deepest, deafest Washington. When Democrats lose the social conservative vote, they lose the election. In 1980, social conservatives voted Republican not only at the presidential level, but in Congress as well. As a result, Democrats lost their Senate majority and over 30 House seats. The balance of power in the House is now held by the conservative Democratic caucus, made up of Southern social conservatives. Mr. Reagan's electoral strategy was successful, but the process have left their old party, but they have not found a new home. They have left a party ruled by liberals to vote for one ruled by fiscal conservatives. The Republican policy at this point remains a matter of fiscal conservatives on the inside, using the votes generated by the appeal to social issues to pursue tax cuts and military expansion. Now, here we are. The primary objective of the new right, then, is the formation of a true alliance of social and fiscal conservatives as equal partners, preferably within the Republican Party. And we'll talk all about that in a minute here when I think it's Whitaker and no, it's Sam Francis who talks about the middle American radicals and revolutionaries with other groups. The Mars, as he talks about them. Obvious as this combination may seem for the success of a permanent conservative ruling party, there are substantial barriers to it in practice. The Republican Party has developed as a party of less government and balanced budgets, and many who within it who are fiscal conservatives are not so on social matters. They hold powerful positions within the party and use their power to prevent a natural alliance from being formed. Until 1980, as William A. Rusher explains in more detail in his essays, Republicans did not so much attract social conservatives as Democrats, and their obsession with social engineering drove them out. That sounds familiar. We can see already the cycle of the left me, and how the ratchet and how the neocon cycle continues. Mr. Reagan's open campaign for social conservative votes is a major step toward a new majority coalition, but only a step. A permanent coalition cannot consist of a party of fiscal conservatives electing its candidates by handing out crumbs to social conservatives who are left outside. For the new majority to be built, social conservatives must become an integral part of the Republican Party. And we kind of already know how that has ended. A little bit depressing there. As an electoral strategy, this is an important matter. The social issues themselves, and into the imposition of the crackpot schemes of liberal elitists, are even more important. But possibly most of all, this may be our last chance to prevent a portion of the American electorate from abandoning the present political approaches and turning to desperate and dangerous alternatives. My own field in the time of political struggle has been spent among people who previously voted Democratic and who carry Union cards, but who are angrier at the liberal establishment than any Washington conservative. These are the West Virginian textbook protesters, wildcat coal strikers, Boston and Louisville anti busing people, and other working people who are in revolt against those who set the liberal direction and those who claim to oppose it. Though its control of working people's traditional means of expression, unions, local governments, and even most churches, I'd argue just about every single church in America these days, America's establishment of the left has been able to smother protests against its social and moral policies. The traditional result of suppressing anti establishment protest, whatever that establishment has called itself, has been to make the final overthrow more violent and more dangerous. But that kind of comes into with accelerationism, I think, as well. Above all, liberals still control the media, so that anti liberal working class protests have been left without an open conduit of public expression. The present drive to represent the 1980 election as a sudden show of dissatisfaction with the economy rather than as a result of 12 years of clear electoral history is a fair, blatant example of the last ditch attempt to prevent any serious airing of popular complaints about liberal social policy. The only accepted critic of liberalism remains fiscally obsessed Republican old right, which have no tradition of sympathy working with people's problems. There is no way of knowing how dangerous such frustration now is, for the same reason it makes it dangerous. Our system presently provides means for neither its expression nor its measurement. I have been part of the social issues protests from its earliest days. I have worked in Washington politics for over 4 years. As a result of my observations, one of the major messages contained in the New Right papers is something of a warning. Now, this is 42 years ago. Let's listen to this warning. My thesis is based on two general propositions. First, the liberal establishment is on its way out. Oh, God, I wish that were true. I wish that were true, Bob. It is now small. It is now a small, powerful elite which is in retreat, protecting itself behind unelected judges and bureaucrats, and is able to impose its will to the exact extent that it can avoid subjecting its dictates to the consent of the governed. That's definitely held up. The courts have still been a way in which almost all major progressive victories have been obtained in America. That or by unelectable bureaucrats. One cannot expect our people to keep faith with a system that which under its decisions affect them are most made by judges and bureaucrats and guided by an ideology they had no part in making. By definition, the people have no part in social engineering. Uh, Largely true and still true today. By definition, yeah. So if the new majority is not formed, social conservatives, a major portion of our population, will be faced with the choice of permanent submission or going outside the political limits as we know them. They will not submit. Most of them have. Well, to some extent. I mean, there was certainly some things going on in the 1990s that would beg to differ, especially when it came to the pro-life movement. But largely, this is true. Several papers presented in this book deal one way or another, or deal with one way or with another, with the restoration of popular rule, populism, or at least basic democratic majoritarianism. Professor William A. Stanmeyer's discussion of the imperial judiciary explains from the point of view of a legal scholar the steady erosion of the power of elected officials and the increasing use of the Constitution as an excuse for, rather than the source of, judicial decisions. Behind such decisions ranges the full power of the United States government, a situation where one man's personal judgment is law, has a name, and it is not democracy. Some of that is slightly changed potentially with the Chevron deference now going away, although that case I think happened in 84, 85. But now it's gone. We'll see how well that goes. But for this is the first time in my lifetime, and really, if any of these guys are still alive, I think a few of them are. Some of them are in their late 80s. They're probably seeing the first time the courts move in the other direction. My second proposition is that rule by the elite through judges and bureaucrats has gone so far that its removal will constitute a revolution, political or otherwise. This is definitely true. A major function of the new right is to provide a means by which it can be kept political. Still, the main going thesis of a lot of people who talk about regime change, such as Curtis Yarvin or Patrick Deneen in his book, Regime Change. Or was it Vermeule? Someone will have to correct me on that. 5 years ago, in, quote, A Plague on Both Your Houses, a book by Bob Whitaker, I described the decline of our liberal ruling powers at a time when they still held control of both houses of Congress and were about to elect their last sympathetic president. The two houses I was attempting to plague were, philosophically, liberals in the old right, and politically, Democrats and Republicans. The book had a few friends in high places, and its thesis was certainly not one calculated to make any. But most of what was said about politics, which was then the most offensive to the ruling cliques of the old right, is now an accepted part, or quote, common sense, of today's political practice. So much that everyone now claims he knew all these things all along. That certainly feels familiar with a lot of these talking points, especially about demographic replacement. But the danger signals I pointed to, which are also developing on schedule, are still ignored. And one of these days we will review A Plague on Both Your Houses. It is pretty clear today that liberal establishment will now be overthrown. The critical questions are how and by whom. President Reagan represents a rebellion, but not the final outcome. Well, we certainly know how that ended from Where the Right Went Wrong by Pat Buchanan. From a historical point of view, the liberal establishment is just one more ruling group whose time has passed. The slaveholder aristocracy of the South elected 8 of our first 11 presidents from its ranks, but by 1850 it was in decline. It too used the courts to defend its remaining power and exercise considerable control over the press to suppress real opposition, so that by the time such a counterforce did arrive on the scene, the result was a civil war and political revolution. The succeeding business establishment, through which dominated politics from Grant to Herbert Hoover, also used the courts, lower court anti strike injunctions, and the Supreme Court against the New Deal to defend its old power. But that establishment went relatively peacefully and co opted many liberal initiatives. For that reason, unlike the slaveocracy, the business establishment kept many of its principles and privileges alive after its displacement at the head of affairs by a liberal establishment. Both the slaveocracy and the liberals put race into central focus. Lincoln, who was a radical in the context of regular politics, said in 1858 that neither he nor anyone he knew sought political or social equality for blacks. 10 years later, that same equality had been written into the Constitution by the Revolution, which overthrew the slaveocracy, and an appeal of similar sort today against the busing and affirmative action oriented liberal establishment would put Klan or Nazi likes into power, a prospect now unthinkable as the racial equality that was to Lincoln. It has been said that Theodore Roosevelt's trust busting and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal helped prevent communist and socialist influence from growing in America. Certainly, it is not hard to imagine what would have happened if the business establishment had been able to discredit all genuine opposition until the 1930s. Genuine opposition to the expansion of chattel slavery did not develop until the nation was hopelessly divided. Probably the group most responsible for the Civil War was the leadership of the Whig Party, which, while slavery expansionism burned and grew as an issue, used the votes it generated against the slaveholding dominated Democratic Party to pursue the old Whig aim of raising tariffs. Slavery was not seriously addressed until the Whig Party was swept out of the way, too late by the Republican Party. This is the danger posed by a Republican Party today, which merely, quote, appeals to social conservatives for votes. They tend to use grassroots rejection of social engineering to serve their traditional causes of government reduction and military expansionism, neoconservatism. The new right seeks to give social issues, a term used by Republicans and liberals alike to describe any domestic issue not concerned with the size of government more than lip service. Among the powers that be in Washington, only the new right is capable of seeing busing and other social experiments as mere symptoms of a deeper malady, and being aware of the dangers that arise from treating only symptoms. Certainly true, although I guess it's important to contextualize the size of government. Before he became president, and this was, of course, during the 1976 election when he was sort of upstaging and sort of trying to usurp the nominee for the GOP from President Ford. You can go find this clip. Maybe it's actually when he was still governor. And Johnny Carson's show, it's either 76 or 1972 or 74 even. And Johnny Carson's talking to Ronald Reagan about what he means by the size of government. He's primarily talking about regulation. He's talking about unelected bureaucrats. And he's also talking about how you create permanent voting blocks through programs, but also by just the size of government employees. Because let's face it, a lot of government employees have their job as sort of a welfare Gibbs system. And so I think that it's important when we say, oh, the size of government, we need to contextualize what that means rather than just looking at it there and take our minds back to 40 and 50 years ago. But again, I think that he is right to say symptoms of a deeper malady. And we know that, these things about lip service, the cultural, social issues, our culture war are things that we're still going to be fighting until there is victory. Because you can't treat symptoms and then in one place the tumor is still growing. Uh, Whitaker continues saying, I emphasize busing and the racial quotas as part of the liberal program, which has driven social conservatives from their ranks because they are illustrative of the broader implications of the division of our country and the dangers it entails. Both are results of bureaucratic and judicial tyranny in the teeth of solid popular opposition. Just go to Pete Quinones' series on Harold Saltzman's book, Race War in High School, if you want to see what that looked like up close. They show the raw power of liberal ideologues over every community in this country. By putting racial minorities in an apparently superior position under the liberal establishment, they threaten, as pressure builds, to make white supremacy of what will be publicly perceived as true opposition. And boy, oh boy, did that come true. Lastly, these issues illustrate the underlying class struggle building in America, as wealthy suburban liberal judges and liberal ideologues force the children of middle class Americans to be bused while their own go to private schools or public ones while outside their jurisdiction. We can not just to be bused, but also to be trans these days. The growing class division in America, of which busing is only a symptom, is examined by Dr. Samuel T. Francis in his discussion of the growing number of middle American radicals, MARS, which we'll hopefully get to his essay today. These are middle class people who are also the middle of the road politically, in the sense that they are neither fiscal conservatives nor liberals. Whereas such a median position usually implies satisfaction, Mars are growing violently and hostile to our present system. This hostility is described from firsthand experience by Robert Hoy, my partner, and along with Bridget Whitaker, in the activities of the Populist Forum. Aiding working people and expressing their grievances against the liberal establishment, we witness potentially revolutionary passion of which Jeff Washington, whose information is only received after passing through the media strainer, could remain unaware until it was too late. And we'll carry on here. But I mean, so far, very familiar to what we're dealing with today. And again, the phrase nothing new under the sun, as one might find in scripture, is certainly true in this case. Except now things are so demographically skewed, you can't get an electoral rebuke like you saw in 1980. But yeah, I mean, it's basically what we're going here. Some symptoms need to be treated. In my country, we have a problem, and that problem is there. Yeah, Seneca says, go paint. I said, I certainly will. Thank you. And Sam153 says, safe travels. Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much. So on Entropy, I greatly appreciate it. But we'll carry on. The alternative to Reagan policy, old left or new right. A continuing theme of writers of every shade of opinion is the similarity between the election of 1932 and that of 1980. At the same time, relative to 1980, they have insisted that Reagan had better deliver, or else. The few who have spelled out or else have done so by saying that this Republicans' golden opportunity. If Reagan doesn't cure our problems, the Democrats and presumably liberal Democrats who dominate the party, like Ted Kennedy, Walter Mondale, and Glenn, will be brought back by the electorate. In other words, what happened in 1980 was a victory of conservatives over liberals, but Democrats remain the popular alternative. Experts reasoned similarly in 1932, and they were wrong. What happened in 1932 was more profound than the obvious victory of liberal candidates over conservative ones. They did not know it then, but that year, conservative Republicans had ceased not only to govern, but to be the real alternative to those who had displaced them. One of the standard jokes in college political science courses has been the confident prediction by the Literary Digest that Alf Landon would trounce Roosevelt in 1936. But the logic which had made this prediction believable to the Digest in 1936 is precisely that followed by commentators today in discussing the Reagan administration. Like Reagan, Roosevelt inherited a huge problem, depression. In 1936, the economy was not noticeably better off than it had been in 1932. Following the FDR had better deliver or else line of reasoning, it seemed that voters would return to the Republicans, the opposition party, to power. As it turned out, Republicans had experienced one of the worst beatings in American electoral history in 1936, carrying only 2 states at the presidential level and being reduced to 89 of the 435 seats of the House of Representatives. Two things were wrong with the 1936 analysts' conclusion. First, while voters might have been upset with FDR's failure to end the Depression, they had no intention of bringing back to power those they had blamed for causing it. Similarly, even with the obvious difficulties President Reagan faces today, without exception, known to have been caused by Democrats generally and liberal Democrats in particular. If he fails to deal with them, will the electorate return liberal Democrats to power? Will they elect John Glenn, Walter Mondale, Ed Kennedy to reduce the size of government and end inflation and strengthen defense? Problems even the national media admit are serious problems created by liberal policies? Again, these things can only exist in a world where America had the demographics it had back then. Um, Today's pundits wrinkle their noses, finger their long beards, and speak of middle of the road as if their positions had been taken by liberal Republicans like Charles Percy or moderate Democrats like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, representing a midway between American political poles fixed externally by some law of nature. Oh boy, if only. Following the same line in 1936, one would have confidently predicted victory for the relatively liberal Republican Alf Landon. But when the votes were counted, even Roosevelt was surprised to discover that the political center had shifted to his own left, represented by the support for liberal Democrats and the popularity of share the wealth schemes of Huey Long. Today, there is an excellent chance for a similar trend in near term politics. In such a case, 1984 will find Reagan victorious and pollsters again scrambling to cover their tracks. Middle of the road sermons are only meaningful if the polls have not shifted. If 1980 is like 1932, nothing could be more absurd than the endless preachments that Reagan must move to the old center. True, we should move rightward. The new right insists that for the good of the country, Reagan should begin co opting potential radicals as soon as possible. New right, meet the new right. Same as the old new right. This recommendation, which pundits must see as unrealistic since their expertise resides in discussing politics as it is and recently has been. Further, it rests on the assumption that which is violently rejected by the still powerful passing establishment and by those who cater to it. The idea that the American left has lost its status even as a primary opposition is not one that the media are likely to embrace with cries of joy. In 1936, the national press was conservative as the big media today are liberal. Certainly, this is as much as anything else was the reason they clung so single-mindedly to the idea that Roosevelt's failure would mean a return to the conservative establishment of Washington. This brings up the second mistake made by those who thought the Republicans would win in 1936. They thought 1932 was a one-time revolt, whereas it had actually the beginning of a long-term revolution. Voters who had, out of a sense of hopelessness, accepted their frustrations with rule by the business establishment through the 1920s suddenly found that it could be, indeed, be beaten. Instead of being pacified by the 1932 results, they were encouraged to aim for more. Those frustrations in the 1920s have their parallels today. In 1928, the average industrial worker in Cleveland was as helpless against his autocratic factory owner as his grandson is today against court ordered busing or hiring quotas. Southerners and Westerners faced discriminatory rail rates, which kept the industry in New England, while their farms suffered a recession during what the East called the Roaring Twenties. Today, with regional prosperity reversed, liberals pour billions into eastern cities while robbing the Sun Belt of billions through oil and gas price controls. Also in the 1920s, the original attempted social engineering, prohibition, was enforced throughout the decade. After 1932, when voters discovered City Hall could be beaten, all these issues became open political questions, and revolt grew into revolution. Liberals cannot think of themselves as tyrants. Dictators, they feel, transport children in the name of Nazism or communism, whereas liberals order busing in the name of social progress, a different thing altogether. Stalin and Hitler broke up communities for evil purposes, whereas liberal programs break them up to achieve racial balance. Down through the ages, rulers have used government power to train children in morals and values different to those of their parents. Liberals use public schools for the same purpose. But that is all right, because liberal values are the right values. That whole paragraph, nothing has changed. Few rulers have ever felt otherwise, but social engineering is pure tyranny and has been tolerated largely because those subjected to it had no hope that it could be stopped. As the awareness that it can be stopped grows, social conservatives will object violently to abuses they previously had no alternative but to accept. Like the slavocracy of the 1850s, the liberal establishment still has many weapons, including the federal courts, at its disposal, just like today with the left in courts. It has the power of national press to discredit the new right and thereby retain its modern Whigs, moderate, fiscally obsessed conservative Republicans as the only, quote, respectable opposition. Uh, Consider your David Frenches of the world. If it is successful in preventing the formation of a new right alternative, interesting there, Bob, an alternative right. A true coalition of social and fiscal conservatives from being formed, it will have used the slavocrats methods, and the results could be very similar as well. Richard A. Aguirre and Paul M. Weyrich are engaged in the building of a new right alternative in Washington. Their papers describe the development of the genuine combination of fiscal and social conservatism to which President Reagan and his successors will have to turn once the middle of the road myth is discredited. And as history tells us, oh, well, once you get elected and you're scrambling for jobs and who's going to be at the face of the administration, we inevitably do know which of these factions won out. Quote, it's the neocons. The Washington New Right has been described as unwilling to compromise with politics as usual. That's true. Still is true today. In a true coalition where fiscal and social conservatives are equal partners, there is no room for simultaneous catering by the Republican Party to moderates and liberals. A new right coalition will reject liberal policies, but it will not adopt the indifference to the needs of the poor, which is part of libertarianism, or its monomaniacal pursuit of bigger defense budgets to which the old right had devoted itself to. It will require new, non liberal approaches and points of view. Again, very similar to what we talk about politics today. It will in the stagnation produced in Washington by over a generation of fixed liberal versus conservative competition, it will be a much needed breath of fresh air. Feels kind of like 2016 in that respect. Papers presented here show the scope of such new search of non liberal alternatives. From Ronald Docksey's discussion of potential for expanding the private nonprofit sector to replace and improve on government social programs, to Robert Moffat's plan for a modern policy to deal with the Soviet Union, to Jeffrey Hart's refreshing look at philosophy and politics, policy alternatives are offered. Clyde Wilson's discussion on the proper relation of citizen and government, and Thomas Fleming's exposition of the Southern traditional criticism of present-day America represent points of view which are relevant, but do not fit into the two-dimensional context of today's liberal-conservative debate. The thrust of my own essay is that Americans first have to call on the fruits of the society they have by their political wisdom made productive. They have a right, therefore, to restrict immigration. Today, immigration from backward countries run by demagogues becomes an ever greater pressure on the developed countries, such a stand must be taken, or developed countries must resign themselves to being overrun. Well, there you go. That's the main issue for us today. And it is argued by some that the overrun is too late. Others say it's not. Only time will tell. As implied by the term papers, this book is not meant to cover all aspects of the new right or to indicate that the authors are in full agreement with each other. The new right is not an ideological construction, but a growing and developing movement. This is not a still life, but a mosaic, the only proper representation of a many faceted coalition. Robert W. Whitaker, Washington, D.C. Not much has changed, but a lot has changed. But again, when we talk about the new right of the 1980s, it feels very similar to what people talk about the new right of today. And since that term keeps getting thrown around, that it's important to consider exactly what these gentlemen were thinking in the wake of their own electoral victories in the 1980s and how we should look at it both in 2016, 2020, and this election in 2024. So we're going to start with the papers, and this one is from William A. Rusher, The New Right, Pasts and Prospects. Actually, I won't do that. What we will do is, let me scroll back up to the beginning, and we will go find ourselves an essay that you gentlemen might want to read. So we have quite a few options. So you have the political context, which has William Rusher's essay, Ins and Means, Jeffrey Hart, if you want the sort of Giga Chad female Jack dialogue, Blue Collar and Blue Bud by Paul Welrick, or if you want Samuel T. Francis's one. I kind of want to go with Sam Francis. I'll let chat decide. You've got Clyde Wilson, You've got New Right Alternatives on Policy, Robert Whitaker, also on societal property rights, Thomas Fleming, Peaceful Coexistence with the Soviet Union. So you've got some options. The New Right and Alternatives in the political context. What do you guys want? Much has changed. Oh yeah, we both know this, rail fanning. We know. Um, so yeah, trust me, I get it. A lot has changed. We'll carry on. I think I'm going to go with the Sam Francis essay. Yes, I'm well aware that the electoral one is there. Let's see here. Judicial Supremacy. I've already read Message from Mars. Well, so have I. I've read this stuff already, but I'm reading for you guys. Actually, we're just going to go with A Message from Mars because I think that has a lot of relevance to what we're dealing with today. So that is page 64. So let's go with 70. Let's see where I get. It's Paul Ryrick's essay. Let's keep going down. There we go. Sam Francis, Message from Mars, The Social Politics of the New Right. This is from Samuel T. Francis. Dr. Francis discusses the general confrontation of class and values which lies behind New Right politics, and his exposition makes the clear importance of the New Right in keeping this struggle in the political arena. Dr. Francis is a legislative assistant to Senator John East of North Carolina. The label "New Right" is at best a confusing one. In the first place, what the label presents is not entirely new, since many of its themes, values, and interests have been expounded to one degree or another by the old right of the 1950s and 60s. In second place, it is not entirely right, since other ideas and values associated with it have seldom been expressed by conservatives of any generation. The new right is perhaps best known for its populism and its heated contempt for elitism and limousine liberals. Its polemical exchanges with the left and even sometimes the right often display a bitterness that was lacking in the amiable sparring bouts of Mr. Buckley and Professor Galbraith. Moreover, the new right voices no small amounts of anti business, but not to say anti capitalist rhetoric. Bankers, multinational corporations, big business, the rich occupy a distinct circle in the new right vision of the inferno. The symbols of wealth are also important in its demonology. The Ivy League, this country club, and the Trilateral Commission. Orthodox conservatives of the old right generally deprecate, smile at, or strain themselves at ridiculing such gaucherie. Yet, if the new right is often the victim of its own rhetoric, it can, in 1981, lay claim to something the old right never had. Political commentators will no doubt debate for years to come whether the Republican capture of the White House and Senate in 1980 was or was not due to the new right efforts alone. But they have never been debated, and never will, whether the old right elected Barry Goldwater in 1964, or Robert Taft in 1952, or Herbert Hoover in 1932. The new right in 1981, and for some years to come, has what the old right never could achieve: a national constituency and the clear possibility of political victory, if not political dominance, in the United States for the remainder of the century. God, if only that were true, we would not be in such dire straits that we are in right now. Despite the incoherence of its name and sometimes of its message, the new right, so this essay and presumably the others contained in this volume will argue, represents far more than a political ideology or an electoral coalition. The new right is a political expression of a profound social movement that reflects the dynamics of American society and that promises to dominate not only politically but perhaps socially and culturally. And again, these are good aims. For us, any sort of social movement needs to be focused solely on immigration at this point and mass deportation. Why it's all right, so we'll go on from there. The origins of the new right in a social movement explain why its political message often appears to be incoherent, contradictory, or simplistic. What the new right has to say is not premeditated in academic seminars, calculated with precision in the inner sanctums of tax exempt foundations, or debated in the stately prose of quarterly and fortnightly journals, although some of that exists today. The contents of its message are perceived injustices, unrelieved exploitation by anonymous powers that be, a threatened future, and an insulted past. It is therefore understandable that the new right has less use for the rhetorical trope and his extended syllogism that for the mass rally and for the truth squad, that not some of its adherents sometimes fantasize that the cartridge box is not an unsatisfactory substitute for the ballot box. Still true today. The social movement that the new right expresses, and whose values, resentments, aspirations, and fears it tries to articulate, is composed in what sociologist Donald I. Warren calls Middle American Radicals, MARS. This movement, in Warren's description, is less an objectively identifiable class than a subjectively distinguished temperament, yet it possesses verifiable features that set it apart from social groups and formations. In the mid 1970s, Mars had a family income of 3,000 to 13,000. There was a strong presence among them from Northern European ethnics, although Italians tended to account for more Mars than any other group. Mars were nearly twice as common in the South as in North Central states. They tended to have completed high school but not have attended college. They were more common among Catholics and Jews than among Protestants, and among Mormons and Baptists than other Protestant sects. They tended to be in their 30s or in their 60s and were significantly less likely to be professional or managerial workers than to be skilled or semi skilled blue collar workers. Yet these statistical features do not define Mars. What defines them as a movement is an attitudinal quality. And what Warren finds most distinctive about them is their view of government, and in the broader sense of the, quote, establishment and their role in it. Unlike the left, Mars do not regard the government as favoring the rich. Unlike the right, they do not regard government as giving too much to the poor. According to Warren, quote, Mars are a distinct group partly because of their view of government as favoring both the rich and the poor simultaneously. Mars are distinct in the depth of their feeling that the middle class has been seriously neglected. If there is one single summation of the Mar perspective, it is reflected in the statement which was to read to respondents: the rich give in to the demands of the poor, and the middle income people have to pay the bill. Very high low versus middle there. Although I do feel as if when we take a look at these demographics here, Northern European ethnics, although Italians tend to account for far more Middle American radicals than any other group. And I wonder if this is how the previous wave of immigration always hates the new wave to get in. Everyone wants to be the last ones on the boat. That should be explored further. I'm sure that there's writing on that as well. I should probably read Warren's original piece. This attitude is resonant with significant social and political implications. It points to a sense of resentment and exploitation, mainly economic but also broader, that is directed upward as well as downward. It points to mistrust of decision makers in state and economy, as well as to fear of the economically depressed. It points also to the frustration of aspirations, to the inalienation of loyalties, and to a suspicion of established institutions, authorities, and values. This is still definitely true today, I would argue, although it has certainly been brought down solely as a hatred of white people, mainly as America's demographics have radically changed from the 1980s. The economic frustrations of Mars, as represented in the above quotation, spill over into political, cultural, social, and moral expression. The objective features of the Mars profile, coupled with the awareness of Mar political ferocity and the new right protests from the anti-busing movements of the early 1970s to the Panama Canal and anti-ERA mobilizations, the Equal Rights Amendment, of 1977 to 78, should substantiate the movement as a social rather than a political in a narrow sense. Mars form a class, not simply a middle class, and not simply an economic category that is in revolt against the dominant patterns and structures of American society. They are, in the broadest sense, a political class, and they aspire through the new right to become the dominant political class in the United States by displacing its current elite, dismantling the apparatus of power, and discrediting its political ideology. Yeah, it's again that word dismantling. People say that this is a relatively recent term that people like to use. Oh, we must dismantle the administrative state. They'll blame that on postmodernism. No, it's written much earlier than just postmodernist critics or structuralist writers. I mean, although let's not kid ourselves, Sam Francis was influenced by them. In Ruling Classes, wrote Gaetano Mosca, the great Italian political scientist of the early 20th century, do not justify their power exclusively by de facto possession of it, but they try to find a moral and legal basis for it, representing it as the logical and necessary consequence of doctrines and beliefs that are generally recognized and accepted. A political formula, as some of you might know. The current elite in the United States, which has held both political and social power since the 1930s, is no exception. Its ideology or political formula by which it rationalizes its power is generally known as liberalism, a set of ideas and values that ostensibly eschews power and upholds equality, liberty, and the brotherhood of man, but which is amazingly congruent with and adaptable to the political, economic, and social interests, the structural interests of the groups that espouse it. This elite seized power in the political and economic crisis of the Depression. And yes, the revolution came in the night of depression. The chief instrument of its rise to power then and in the following decades was the state, especially the federal government, and more especially the executive branch. Through the state, it made common cause with certain mass organizations, large corporations, labor unions, universities, foundations, and the media, and has generally favored their expansion and strengthening at the expense of smaller scale units, regulatory capture, bureaucracy, and the like. In domestic affairs, it has favored federally enforced economic planning and social engineering for the purpose, at least ostensibly, of realizing its liberal ideology. In foreign affairs, it has until recently favored international activism through similar large scale organizations and transnational alliances that seem to promote the global fraternity and disappearance of international distinctions and differences. It still does this. That did not stop. That still continued. In political theory, it has abandoned the idea of neutral government based on impartial laws and administering equal justice and associated itself with the concept of the state as intimately involved in social and economic processes as an architect of desirable social change. Again, no such thing as a neutral institution. No such thing as a neutral institution. This concept has been buttressed by a variety of pseudoscientific ideologies, psychoanalysis, behavioralism, legal positivism, applied psychology, Marxism, educational progressivism, etc., most of which are logically incompatible with liberalism and are nevertheless abridged, distorted, and popularized into congruence with its current ideological fixations. And again, almost every single one of those ideologies has been founded with explicit purposes of going against Western and European values, sciences, and traditions and ideas. But that's sort of the demon in democracy and the demon in liberalism, anyways. This is that, good liberals, like for instance, I'm a New Deal Democrat, as we see in that Oppenheimer film, indistinguishable from communism. Indistinguishable. Indistinguishable. It is in its cultural and social ideologies and lifestyles that the new elite has developed what is probably the clearest indicator of its dominant position. The lifestyles, aspirations, and values of the current elite are bound together, rationalized, and extended by what might be called a cosmopolitan ethic. This ethic expresses an open contempt for what Edmund Burke called the little platoons of human society. The small town, the family, the neighborhood, the traditional class identities and their relationships, as well as for the authoritative and disciplinary institutions, the army, police forces, parental authority, the disciplines of school and church. The cosmopolitan ethic, reversing a Western tradition as old as Aesop, finds virtue in the large city and the anonymous and therefore liberated relationships of the declassed, desexed, demoralized, and deracinated atoms that know no group or national identities, accept no given moral code, and recognize no disciplines and no limits. The ethic idealizes the material indulgence, the glorification of the self, the transcendence of conventional values, loyalties, and social bonds. At the same time, it denigrates the values of self sacrifice, community, and moral social order. Its most perfect, though extreme, expression is perhaps Mick Jagger, although a more typical and vapid form is portrayed in the advertisements that tell us what kind of man reads Playboy. Sure feels familiar, doesn't it, kids? That cosmopolitan ethic sure has gotten itself in some places. The ideology or formula of liberalism grows out of the structural interest of the elite that espouses it. Liberalism barely exists as an independent set of ideas and values. Virtually no significant thinker of the century has endorsed liberalism, and many have explicitly rejected, criticized, or even ridiculed it. Internally, the doctrines of liberalism are so contrary to established fact, inconsistent with each other, and immersed in sentimentalism, resentment, and egotism that it cannot be taken seriously as a body of ideas. Liberalism flourishes almost entirely because it reflects the material and psychological interests of a privileged, power-holding, and power-seeking sector of American society. In the early 20th century, the increasing massiveness of American society appeared to demand a new organizational forms of control. The imperatives of mass scale in the economy, in government and politics, and in social and cultural life gave rise to a new elite that found its principal power base in bureaucracy. In both the public and private sectors, the bureaucratic organization of power and control appeared to be the only means of ruling modern mass units. In the private sector, the evolution of bureaucratic dominance followed the separation of ownership and control in the large corporations that took the form of managerial direction of very large corporate firms. In government, modern bureaucracy developed in a more sudden and revolutionary way in the crisis of the Depression. Yet there was no fundamental difference between the interests of the two bureaucratic realms. See, that private public distinction gets real hard to determine even back then as it is today. Both sectors shared a common mentality, a rationalistic faith in the administrative and manipulative techniques as a means of holding and exercising power. Both sectors, perhaps more importantly, shared certain common material interests. The more massive the scale of organization, the more imperative the bureaucratic managerial form of organization. That managerial revolution, if you will. The same or similar interests and imperatives pertained in mass scale organizations, and the same dominant bureaucratic function developed in control of the mass unions. Similarly, but more recently, the media of mass communication in almost every form, book publishing, news, entertainment, documentaries, etc., have displayed the same dynamic of elite formation, as have most recently the instruments of legitimate force, the armed forces in the larger metropolitan police departments. Unlike the older, more localized and personal elites of American society, the new elite possesses a more uniform mentality and a more homogeneous interest. The expansion of mass units of organization under the bureaucratic forms of governance, animated by an ideology of manipulative, administrative, social engineering, what our friend Orrin McIntyre likes to call the total state. From its very nature, therefore, the new elite found liberalism as a useful and indeed indispensable formula for rationalizing its existence and modern power. Rizard Lakutko's book, The Demon and Democracy, I would argue is a really good book on the subject. Modern liberalism allowed for government on a mass scale and for bureaucratic manipulation of social norms and economic processes. Liberalism allowed for an economy led by mass corporations, they themselves governed by, quote, progressive executives. Just look at the Ford Foundation, on whose positions depend on merit and schooling in managerial sciences and not on inheritance, experience, or the virtues of the Protestant work ethic. Liberalism championed schooling itself, especially in education, also on a mass scale, that emphasized the practical disciplines of social science, public administration, and modern business management. Just look up some quotes on Dewey in education. Finally, liberalism at its very center articulated a vision of man that not only allowed for bureaucratic manipulation of his environment, but also laid the groundwork for the cosmopolitan ethic. The great value of this ethic in the rise of new bureaucratic elite was to discredit the formulas and ideologies of its older rivals. You have to subvert it, you have to wear it as its skin suit. Liberalism is the skin suit of our current managerial elite. It's not even liberalism anymore. No one talks about it, except to say, I guess, the Trump campaign calling Kamala Harris dangerously liberal. Liberalism and cosmopolitanism were able, through their immense appeal to an intelligentsia, to portray localism and decentralized institutions as provincial and a mask for bigotry and selfishness, the small town, the family, class, religious, ethnic, and community ties as backward, repressive, and exploitative, the values of work, thrift, discipline, sacrifice, postponement of gratification, on which as values the moral legitimacy of older elites rested, as outmoded, absolutist, puritanical, superstitious, and not infrequently hypocritical. Again, we live in two totally different worlds, two totally different work ethics, two totally different languages. JD Vance is weird. Trump is weird. Well, what does weird mean? You and I may have a totally different idea of that. We might look to the various trannies and child sacrifices that the left will perform, and they'll say JD Vance says cat ladies are bad for the West, and they'll find that weird. But again, two totally different models of values and systems. Again, not all that undifferent than today. A more direct connection between the material interests of the new elite and the semi-collectivist ideology of liberalism exists also. The mass economy of the 20th century requires a mass level of consumption for the financing of its productive capacities. Due to the inability of lending institutions in the Depression to mobilize sufficient credit for the resumption of production, the federal government undertook labor policies, transfer programs, and pension policies designed to ensure sufficient demand for the mass economy to function. You can see this through Social Security. The immediate beneficiary of these policies, of course, was the impoverished underclass of American society, but ultimate beneficiaries were the new managerial and bureaucratic elites in corporations and government. The stimulation of demand through government policy, a policy financed by the middle class taxpayers and consumers, ensured the existence and dominance of the mass organization of government, a corporation, and union and their managerial elites. At the same time, this policy cemented an alliance not only among the different sectors of the new elite, but also between the new elite as a whole and the proletariat of American society against the remnants of the old elite and the exploited and excluded middle class. And this would eventually lead to the effective de Anglicization of both the American left and right, although what's left of sort of that progressive WASP mentality is still around in American democratic politics today. But if you look towards why so many conservatives today look towards, say, German Catholic Jewish thinkers a lot, you'll see that a lot of the old right itself have been so effectively dethroned that it too itself saw its replacement. Also, because the new elite institutions selected against them. The new elite, following a pattern that has been repeated many times in human history, also found that the aggrandizement of the federal executive branch was conducive to its revolution. The old elites were based mainly in local and state governments and in the Congress. The Caesarist political style of the new elite used the presidency under Roosevelt and Truman and their successors to attack, wear down, usurp, and discredit the authority of both state and local bodies in Congress. This is true today. You once usually had cooperative or collective federalism. Now you have coercive federalism. Washington tells you that the drinking age is 21 or you lose your highway funding. Just an easy example. In this new political style, the rising managerial elite was following a pattern evident in the careers of Pericles, Caesar, Henry Tudor, Louis XIV, Napoleon Bonaparte. Older elites, entrenched in the established institutions, are attacked by newer social formations, whether that be ethnic or intellectual, that make alliances with charismatic leaders exercising autocratic power and with an underclass that receives material benefits expropriated from the old elite. Obama's a good example of this. New centralized institutions controlled by the new elite develop in place of the localized institutions of the old rulers. A pattern often associated with this sandwich attack on the old elite, again, high, low versus middle, by an alliance of underclass and autocrat as an activist and expansionist foreign policy, led by the new men in opposition to passive, often isolationist policies associated with the old ruling elite. Thus, Pericles promoted Athenian imperialism through enfranchisement of the lower class crews of the Athenian navy and against the interests of the landed, inwardly looking Attic oligarchy. Caesar's revolution in Rome made it possible by his patronage of the lower classes was to be extended in his imperial military adventures in the East, but this was cut short by his assassination. The Tudors, Louis XIV, and Napoleon all embarked on expansionist foreign policies that sought to benefit the aspirations and interests of the new elites on which their own power was based. The older elites oppose expansionism because their own power base are not equipped to profit from it and are indeed frequently threatened by the rise of new powers and forces in the newly acquired territories. This pattern was also present in the revolution of the managerial elite of the Depression and World War II era. The old guard of the Republican Party, representing the old elite, was isolationist in both world wars. The new elite found that both its economic and political interests benefited by an activist, globalist foreign policy. The new power structures revolving around international and regional blocs, new markets and trade arrangements, and new internal institutions for international relations, conflict were all congruent with the interest of the new elite in government, industry, finance, education, and labor. It is against this new elite, which Irving Kristol and others belatedly called the new class, but which James Burnham inaccurately and much earlier called the managerial class, that the new right with its Mars social base operates. It would be tendentious to claim that the ideologies and institutions of the managerial class are purely self-serving while claiming also that those of Mars are objectively true, public-spirited, and general interest, and morally pure. The Mars form a socio-political force now coalescing into a class and perhaps into a new elite that will replace the managerial one. As a rising political class, the Mars have their own interests, aspirations, and values, and these are not intended to benefit the nation, society as a whole, or humanity. Nevertheless, the structural interests of the Mars, what is of benefit to them because of their position and functions in American society, may be beneficial to America as well. The Mars, similar social forces now developing in the Sun Belt, promise a new dynamism in America, economically as well as spiritually, in place of a now decadent and moribund managerial elite. They also offer a discipline, a code of sacrifice for something much larger than themselves, and a new purpose that is beyond the reach of the jaded, self indulgent, increasingly corrupt elite of the present day. The Mars are not better or worse than other human beings in other social formations, but the objective interests of their formation appear to dictate a social order quite different from, and probably better than, that designed, manipulated, and misruled by the managerial class and its cohorts. Still often the subject for today's politics, I would argue. It's still middle white America versus both coastal elites, although you're beginning to see a quote unquote new right faction. Silicon Valley has thrown its way behind Trump, which has more or less the command of white middle American Republican voters. And it too wishes to see interests for themselves be pursued, which may not be beneficial to the rest of the country, but the rest of the country, I think, be damned in this instance when it comes to immigration and trade and manufacturing. What the Mars and the New Right seek, then, is the overthrow of the present elite and its replacement by themselves, still the subject of today's debates, which either tells us that these debates have failed and these efforts have failed, or they were co opted, destroyed, or utterly ruined. And we certainly saw that with Bob Whitaker, and we certainly saw that with Sam Francis. All it took was, someone saying that Sam Francis spoke at Amren, and here we are. And the rest is history as we sort of know it. This is a revolutionary goal, no less so than the goal of the rising managers of the early part of the century. It is the revolutionary, not in the sense that it is the realization it will require violent rebellion, mass liquidation, or totalitarian rule. Let's not throw those out. Those are not envisioned by the new right and would be antithetical to Mars' interests, but in the sense that the replacement of one elite by another almost always leads to a cultural renaissance, to a new dynamic forces that alter ideas and institutions, and to an efflorescence of material and spiritual life. Yet the new right will not be will not be the spearhead of the Middle American Revolution, if it is concerned only with the politics in a narrow formal sense. It must go beyond the tactics of electoral coalitions and roll call votes to develop a strategy for the seizure of real social power. Real power is not limited to the control of formal apparatus of government, but extends to the levers of which human societies are controlled, to the media of communication, the means of production, and the instruments of force. At the present time, these levers of social control and real social power are almost entirely dominated by the managerial elite or are negated by it. Formal control of the political apparatus will not alter this fact. That's true. You can get into office and then realize you don't have any power. We saw that with Trump's first term. And we saw this in countless other local administrations as well, on a gubernatorial as well as city level. The new right Mar coalition must seek to dismantle or radically reform the managerial apparatus of social control, and this objective means a far more radical approach to political conflict and to contemporary institutions. The strategic objective of the new right must be the localization, privatization, and decentralization of the managerial apparatus of power. Concretely, this means not only dismantling the corporate, educational, labor, and media bureaucracies, but a devolution to a more modest scale of organizational units, and a reorientation of federal rewards from mass scale units and hierarchies to smaller and more local ones. There's a lot to unpack in that entire paragraph, because it raises some interesting questions, and it raises some interesting observations, I think. For starters, you've got a political desire to replace them, but also to dismantle and bring back a less coercive federalism to sort of end where the big NGO money will get. There's a Twitter account I follow, and I wish I knew the name of it off the top of my head. I will put it in the comments section. Actually, what I will do is I'll just see if I can go look it up in my follow list. Is that you have this series of it's just a I think it's like a bot account, and all that it does is like post the uh, federal grants that get put out on there. Yeah, it's called randoland.us. 22.3 thousand followers on Twitter, and I'll go share this tab instead. So you can go see this one, and you can just sort of look up Administration for Children and Families Grant 2023, amount $38,635,973. State of North Carolina, Department of Health and Human Services. Um, General year 2023 refugee support services and set asides. $38 million Administration for Children and Families grant going to refugees. Raises an interesting question. We're talking about the same issues here of decentralizing, devolution, total dismantling. None of that's happened yet. Here's another one. Administration for Children and Families Grant 2022. $750,000, $750,000 to the Catholic Archdiocese of Galveston and Houston. Refugee career pathways. Here's another one. $1,620,095. Missouri Department of Human Services. General year 2022 ORR refugee cash and medical assistance. $1.6 million. This needs to be destroyed. This needs to be gutted. Has to end. Has to go away. But also, if we go back to our text, and we look here, we will notice one, our managerial elites are far more ingrained in all aspects of these powers. And this new right Mar coalition, if we want to go back in time, and I guess our 2024 equivalent is going to be Silicon Valley and middle white America. And that's what you're dealing with. We've already seen the lovely scales of how jobs in the corporate world donate to political parties. We have already witnessed, even inside various churches, we see this a lot with our Protestant friends, what they call regime evangelicals, or Big Ava, Big Evangelical. Like the editor of Christianity Today, supporting, sodomites and other terrible things, while they openly deride people for wanting to vote in their own self-interest for, immigration restriction or conservative politicians. But also, this is from 40 some odd years ago, and we're still talking about the same things today. That raises some uncomfortable questions. Why did we lose? Why did they lose? And more importantly, are we simply ramming our heads down old holes made by ostriches and rabbits, thinking we've discovered something new? Or are we simply repeating the mistakes of yesteryear? And if we are repeating the mistakes of yesteryear, what mistakes were they, and how can we avoid them? But also, we also owe so much to our own political understanding of things from these gentlemen, especially Sam Francis and Robert Whitaker and the rest, even if we don't know them or know them particularly well. And I think that Pat Buchanan, when he talks about where the right went wrong, and he talks about neoconservatism, certain lobbying for ethnic coalitions against sort of white majority America at the time, still is the case today, and how that's being brought out. Yeah, there's going to be a lot more radicalism in the coming future for sure. But we'll carry on here. To include the large corporations in the enemies list of the new right may strike many adherents of the old right as odd or even as subversive. Yet libertarians have long recognized that large, publicly owned, manager-dominated corporations have interests and political orientations similar or quite different of those of small, privately owned, controlled enterprises. As G. William Domhoff, a radical sociologist, recognized, quote, the business people who were most isolationist, anti-welfare, and anti-labor were more likely to be in the National Association of Manufacturers and to be associated with smaller, more regional corporations. Those who were more moderate, i.e. liberal, were more likely to be in the Committee for Economic Development and to manage larger companies. More recently, our study of the corporate interlocks of CED and NAM leaders revealed the same small-large dichotomy. For example, NAM's directors for 1972 had only 9 connections to the top 25 banks, whereas CED had 63. Similarly, NAM had but 10 connections to the 25 largest industrials, while CED had 48. The findings were similar for insurance, transport, utilities, and retails. End quote. The present managerial elite, whether in the public or private sector, has a vested interest in centralized decision making and collective organization. The dynamic of Mar interests dictates ultimately a policy of localization and privatization of real social power in both the public and private sectors. Return it back to the people, return it back to the majority. Only by unleashing the now overregulated, overtaxed, and unrewarded Mars social and economic forces can their innovative and productive potential be developed. This unleashing of Mar forces can come about only by dismantling the managerial power structure. Still, I think holds true today. To call the new right, quote, conservative, then, is true only in a rather abstruse sense. Its social and cultural values are indeed conservative and traditionalist, but unlike almost any other conservative group in history, it finds itself not only out of power in a formal sense, but also excluded from informal centers of real social power. Consequently, the political style, tactics, and organizational forms of the new right find a radical anti establishment approach better adapted to the achievement of its goals. Ideologically, much in the formulas and theories, insofar as there is any, of the new right, derives from exponents of the old right. And we're talking about the old right from the Great Depression up to the 1950s and 60s. Yet, in the premise of almost all old right publicists has been that of values and institutions they were defending were part of an establishment that was under revolutionary attack. For much of the period the old right flourished, this premise was correct. This is why, again, you should read The Revolution Was, because he's calling out his fellow rightists at the time, saying, you're defending institutions that have already been taken over. And you saw the same thing with sort of this Peter Hitchens style conservatism that as long as the institution survives, will be survive. America, England, any European nation, it's its people. It's not an institution. Institutions are made up by people. And if you don't have those people, they're gone. And those institutions are effectively dead. They will wear the Church of England like a skin suit. They will wear Boy Scouts of America like a skin suit to put tranny kids in it or girls in it. It's no longer Boy Scouts. They will do what they can to destroy it. You don't have to defend institutions. You don't have to defend institutions. You have to defend people and what you believe in. Today, however, and since at least the mid 1960s, the revolution of mass and managers has triumphed, entrenched itself in a new elite, and indeed has revealed the strong signs of ossification and decadence. The old right failed to arrest the revolution mainly because it lacked an adequate social base. Its powerful, well honed, but esoteric critique of liberal ideology appealed to few save the most sophisticated intellectuals and the declining entrepreneurial elite whose interests and values were reflected in conservative theory. The new right must consciously abandon much of its inertial conservatism of its old right premises. It must cease congratulating itself on its ability to raise money and win elections within a system developed by the present establishment and begin formulating a strategy for besieging the establishment. With its Mar social base, the new right is in a strong position to develop such a strategy, and there are signs that some parts of it are doing so. Some new right groups have successfully politicized sections of American society. Smaller businessmen, broadcasters, clergy, parent groups, and other institutional representatives have played an active and important role in the new right political campaigns. Very similar to today. Very similar today with Trumpism. However, a key element in the success of the new right will be its ability to focus on how the establishment uses its apparatus of power in the media, corporations, schools, etc., for political domination and exploitation. This has been made reasonably clear with regard to the bureaucracy and the unions, but other institutional supports of liberal managerial elite need exposure as well. In economics, the old right has consistently defended the free market. While there is much to be said for the renaissance of free market ideas led by von Mises, Hayek, Friedman, Laffer, and others, it is doubtful that the Mar coalition and its allies in the Sunbelt entrepreneurial regions will continue to focus on this classical liberal principle. Very true. You can look at the post-liberals today with like J.D. Vance or Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott finally trying to swing some executive power against corporations. Even if it's largely ineffective, it's a move in the right direction. It is more likely that Mars' Sunbelt interest will require a strong governmental role in maintaining economic privileges for the elderly and unionized labor where it now exists, and that they will also require or demand subsidization of construction and perhaps characteristic Sunbelt enterprises, energy, defense, aerospace industries, and agriculture. One new right tactic would be for the payment of these subsidies and privileges out of the proceeds of taxing the Frost Belt and reorienting economic policy and legislation toward the South and the West. For the new right to embrace such a tactic openly, as well as what some might be favorable attitudes towards protectionism, Trump, would be frank recognition that the classical liberal idea of a night watchman state is an illusion, and that a Mar elite would make use of the state for its own interests as willingly as the present managerial elite does. So many are afraid of power, but still, you got to learn how to embrace power and how to wield it and actually how to govern. You will need people in business. You will need people who are wealthy. You will need people who know how to organize. They'll come from all walks of life. Um, as the state continues to bring us its thumb down on itself and continues to get more into an ethnic spoil system, the ability to formulate small coalitions locally and on a state level to survive and look out for yourself will be required. It's just that simple. I don't have a lot of faith that things will be turned around here, but perhaps we can learn something from these people to squeak out and survive. Mar resentment of welfare, paternalism, and regulation is not based on a profound faith in the market, but simply on the sense of injustice that unfair welfare programs, taxes, and stifling regulation has bred. The central focus of the Mar New Right political economy is likely to be economic growth, a value often confused with sometimes encompassing, but not identical to the free market. Economic growth is good, but line go up for the sake of a billion Bamalians entering your country is not worth free market economics or economic growth. To quote a certain man from Swindon, you can just say fuck the GDP. It's not a good measurement. Clearly, economic growth involves the lifting of most legal and administrative restraints on enterprise, the demise of the environmentalist legislation and OSHA. God, that would make my job so much easier. The sale of federally owned land in the far west, etc., but would also include government assistance to dynamic but underfed sectors of the economy, e.g., the space program and new technology forms. The role of government in stimulating growth is no less inconsistent with free market ideals than its role in retarding growth. Since the social forces of the new right would have a strong interest in the former role, there is little value in the adherence to a strict laissez faire ideology. The promotion of a no growth cultus by powerful elements of the current liberal managerial elite is strong evidence of its decadence and ossification. The quote selective isolationism in foreign policy, the withdrawal from the third world in conflict with the Soviets, and the guilt experienced for our past foreign policy are also indications of decadence. The fundamental reason for the fall of Vietnam, the United States' retreat from Angola, the betrayal of Somoza, and the desertion of Taiwan, the collapse of the Shah, as well as weakening our containments and other third world allies, lies in the inability of our present elite to deal effectively with the often brutal realities of the third world, and the failure that liberal formulas of the elite to rationalize necessary and desirable policies for dealing with these realities, and a preference by its elite to deal with other elites similarly in developed regions, Japan, Western Europe, and the Soviet Union. The rationalistic, administrative, and technical skills on which the power of the managerial class is based are of little value in undeveloped regions, especially where the violent resistance is planning and the manipulation requires a more coercive response than the managerial ideology can justify. Man, so much of like the Cold War stuff in here feels just so ancient. But I mean, this is basically true to a lot of sense. You can't have a liberal formula there. I mean, this is the basic critique that Ron Paul was talking about back in 2008, back in 2012. His son Rand Paul has talked about it. You can't turn an Iraqi who grew up with Saddam Hussein and turn him into Thomas Jefferson. You can't make people what they aren't. You cannot make someone who knows third world despotism to embrace democracy. And even when they do, it's brutal, it's violent, it's ugly, it's not the Western civilized world that you expect. So I guess to a large degree, some of this still holds up. I would. There's an essay on foreign policy in here. Maybe we'll get to that next. Moreover, the material interests of the elite, as well as its psychic interests and ideological ideological orientation, impel towards the developed world. Ideologically, the current elite distrusts nationalism and favors internationalist and regionalist units of organization, the UN, the common market, the British Commonwealth, the Atlantic Community, etc. This preference is in accord with its cosmopolitan ethic, but also accords with the economic interests of the larger corporate entities. Free trade, the integration of international markets, and the stabilization of international relations all reflect the interests of the transnational elites that dominate in the developed countries. In contrast, smaller producers situated in the Sun Belt require protection against cheap imports and access to these raw materials and resources of the Third World, and they are less committed to the international stability than the continued predominance of the United States. Yeah, also, transnational elites have no care for local workers. We can see that with large international corporations outsourcing and the great giant sucking sound that Ross Perot talked about when it came to NAFTA. The foreign policy of the new right, then, reflecting the interests and the values of its Mars Sunbelt neo entrepreneurial base, is likely to endorse a new nationalism that insists on the military and economic preeminence of the United States, on international activism, and even expansionism in world affairs, at least on some measure of protection for domestic producers, and on far more resistance to third world arrogance, regression, and barbarism. The controversy over the Trilateral Commission, whatever its merits, reflects this conflict over foreign policy and the social forces that of the dominant elite and those of the new right. Kind of see this a little bit today with sort of the Eric Prince return to colonialism. But I mean, protectionism is popular now more than ever, I think, with a lot of people on the quote unquote new right of the 2020s, at least on economics and foreign policy. You have to hire your own people, you have to work with your own people, no H-1Bs, we're talking about deportation. I mean, there's a start. But again, America is far worse off demographically than it was 40 years ago. The commission is essentially the forum of the elite and its multinationalist components. I think about the Davos Forum and stuff like that. As such, it has become a symbol of the resentments of Mars and other forces of the Sun Belt. Moreover, the nationalism of the new right will probably replace the anti-communism of the old right as a focus of foreign policy. While the Soviet Union, Cuba, and their allies remain the principal threat to the United States and our predominance, new right elements are likely to focus on the threat itself rather than on the ideological origins of the threat. The distinction between the nationalist focus of the new right and the anti-communist orientation of the old became clear in the opposition to the Panama Canal Treaty. While old right anti-communists sought to portray the late Panamanian dictator Omar Torrijos Herrera as a Marxist, this was far less of an effective tactic than Ronald Reagan's new right nationalist slogan on the canal: "We built it, we paid for it, and it's ours." Very true. And that should be a good attitude to have. It's healthy, it's nationalistic, it's for your people. The nationalism of the new right points to what is perhaps its best known characteristic: the rejection of the cosmopolitan ethic of the I have to focus on saying ethic of the managerial elite and the thunderous defense of moral and social traditionalism. The most offensive component of cosmopolitanism to Mars is its abstract universalism, its refusal to make any distinctions or discriminations among other human beings. We see this a lot with the hatred of human biodiversity. We see this a lot with, we can't simply say men are men and women are women, and so on. Things to consider in that respect. But yeah. So much of this has held up, which only begs really concerning questions. The brotherhood of the brotherhood of man, egalitarianism, the relativization of moral values, and the rejection of conventional social and cultural identities as obsolete and repressive all derive from this universalist tendency. In its place, the central formula of the rising Mars Sunbelt elite is likely to form on what might be called a domestic ethic that centers on the family, the neighborhood, the local community, the church, and the nation as the basic framework of values. The values associated with domestic ethic will contrast sharply with those of cosmopolitanism: the duty of work rather than the right of welfare, the value of loyalty to concrete persons, symbols, and institutions rather than the cosmopolitan dispersion of loyalties, and the social and human necessity of sacrifice and delayed gratification rather than the cosmopolitan managerial demand for immediate gratification, indulgence, and consumption. And you can see the racial underpinnings and undertone of that entire breakdown. The domestic ethic may also lay for the basis of a more harmonious relationship between employer and worker, since the place of work itself can be portrayed as an institution no less central than the family or the local community, the company man. The common interest of workers and employers in opposing the restrictive stagnationist policies of the managerial elite is one element of new right rhetoric that could develop into this harmony, and the explicit approach of blue collar workers by the recent new right candidates appear to confirm this trend. I'm feeling Trumpy today. I'm having a Diet Coke. Out of the structural interests and residual values of Mars are similar forces in the Sun Belt and in the new entrepreneurial forces throughout the country. The new right can construct a formula or ideology. This formula will reflect the demands for economic growth, a more aggressively nationalistic foreign policy, an assertion of traditionalist ethics and loyalties. It will not be conservative, although it will encompass some ideas of the old right and reject others. It will, in fact, be a radical formula, demanding changes not only in the formal appearance of power, but also in the realities of the distribution and uses of power in its social forms. As a radical movement representing rising social forces against an ossified elite, the new right must abandon the political style of the old right. That style, based on the premise that the old right represented an establishment, sought to defend intermediary institutions against the Caesarist leveling forces of the new managerial class. The managerial class, however, has long since become the establishment and shows signs of abandoning the executive branch as a spearhead of its power seizure. It's true. Even the executive. Well, that's not really true. You don't really need a figurehead as long as you control the bureaucracy, a permanent state. The new right, therefore, should make use of the presidency as its own spearhead against the entrenched elite and should dwell on the fact that the intermediary bodies, Congress, the courts, bureaucracy, the media, etc., are the main supports of the elite. The adoption of the Caesarist tactic by the new right would reflect. Red Caesar? Anyone? Anyone hearing anything familiar here? The adoption of the Caesarist tactic by the new right would reflect the historical pattern by which rising classes ally with an executive power to displace the oligarchy that is entrenched in the intermediate bodies. Project 2025, Schedule F employees, putting in task forces to end anti-white or anti-Christian discrimination has been discussed by the Trump campaign on rallies. Again, not much has changed there. I'll be a dictator for a day. Just a day. If you vote for me, you never have to vote again. Heard that before, and we've heard it recently. Jeffrey Hart has suggested that this idea of a new right, Caesarist style based on the presidency, but apparently without attracting broad support. While the new right can expect to make gains in Congress and state and local governments, only the presidency, as Nixon and Agnew showed, has the viability and resources to cut through the intractable establishment of bureaucracy and the media to reach Mars social base directly. But he was cooed out of office. Only the presidency is capable of dismantling or restructuring the bureaucratic managerial apparatus that now strangles the latent dynamism of the Mars Sunbelt social forces. The key to this Caesarist strategy is that the new right does not now represent an elite, but a sub-elite, that it must acquire real social power and not preserve it in its current distribution. The intermediate institutions of contemporary America, the bureaucracy, the media, and the managerial hierarchies of mass unions and corporations, the universities and the foundations, the urban conglomerates are not allies of the new right and are not conservative influence except in the sense that they serve to protect established powers. Hence, the new right should not defend these structures, but should expose them as power preserves of the entrenched elite whose values and interests are hostile to the traditional American ethos and which is a parasitical tumor on the body of middle America. This is very good rhetoric. I love it. I love it. These structures should be leveled, or at least radically reformed. Only the presidency has the power and the resources to begin and process and mobilize popular support for it. How true that is today remains to be seen. Then again, you also need someone who knows what he's doing and a team around that man who knows what he's doing in order to do it. Is Trump that guy? I don't know. He gets in, people around him, can they be that guy? Maybe. But you know my position on this, and it's always the same line I quote from the Psalter. I take trust not in princes and the sons of men, for in whom is no salvation, very literally. But he is better than the current alternative. The characterization of the new right presented in this essay is unconventional and perhaps will be controversial. The new right is not merely an electoral coalition concerned with winning elections and roll calls. It is the political expression of a relatively new social movement that regards itself as the depository of traditional American values and as the exploited victim of the alliance between an entrenched elite and a ravenous proletariat. Viewed in this socio political preservative, the new right is not a conservative force, but a radical or a revolutionary one. It seeks the displacement of the entrenched elite, discarding of its ideology of liberalism in America. The new right is able to aspire to these ambitions because, unlike the old right, it has the viable social base and middle American radicals and the dynamic economy of the Sun Belt. If the new right is not conservative, it should be clear that it will need a new ideology, formula, or political theory that can win the loyalties and represent the interests of its social power base, which can rationalize its quest for social and political power. Whether that be sort of the Californian ideology of these Silicon Valley types, say like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, or perhaps I guess you could throw neo reaction into that as well to some extent, or the I just want to be left alone, make America great again, the sort of middle American radicals, that we're seeing today in 2024. Um, it is angry. It is you guys can't do shit anymore. You guys are literally making it impossible for America to exist. So I mean, it's hard for me to be optimistic because it's like, well, we've seen how this has all played out before. And to know that these guys were saying the same things that many of our pundits and our friends and colleagues talk about today is a pretty damnable implication that they didn't succeed. What makes our odds any better when America is demographically far worse than what it is? I'm not trying to be black-pilled. I'm just raising concerns of, well, where did they go wrong? Where are we going wrong? And have we learned our lesson? I hope so. The lesson is to not compromise and to take no prisoners and to actually fire them. I guess that rage aspect, retire all government employees, is viable. I guess it just depends on what you mean by retire. Send them packing or in the Blade Runner sense of the word. The primary justification of its quest for power must be the corruption, decadence, incompetence, oppressiveness, and alienation of the old elite that is seeking to displace. This elite, identified here as the managerial class that rose to power in government bureaucracy in the large corporations or modern mass-scale organizations since the 1930s, is clearly foreign to the bulk of the nation and its lifestyle, values, and ideals. Yet these lifestyles, values, and ideals cannot simply be discarded by the old elite. They represent a logical outgrowth of its own structural interests. Large social engineering government in alliance with corporations, universities, and foundations, the mass media, unions, and other bureaucracies. The only cosmopolitan ethic and liberal ideology described above can rationalize these structural interests in the entrenched elite. The fundamental problem, therefore, is not an ethic or ideology of the elite, but the elite itself. And it is the elite and the apparatus of power that must be the main target of new right attack. Still holds true today. The principal values to which the new right should appeal in this attack differ from those defended by the old right as well as those articulated by the managerial elite. In place of a market, the old right, or the stabilization of the present elite, the new right should center its economic aspirations on the concept of economic growth. Clearly, the concept of growth involves dismantling of the bureaucracy, regulation, fiscal and environmentalist policies, and a decentralization and privatization of economic forces. But this reorientation towards a freer economic climate is incidental to the central idea of economic growth, expansion, and dynamism. We must build things again. We must be, well, think about it, as Joe Biden would say. Well, think about it, man. Think about it. And he's trying so hard not to say make America great again. In place of a strictly anti-communist foreign policy, the old right, or the selective isolationism of the decadent managerial class, the new right should assert a foreign policy founded on a new activist and expansionist nationalism, a policy that would necessarily encompass old right anti-communism, but would also respond to non-communist threats that are rising. In place of the hedonistic, pragmatist, relativist, and secularized cosmopolitanism of the current elite, the new right should expound without compromise the ideals and institutions of the American ethos. Hard work and self-sacrifice, morally based legislation and policies, and a public commitment to religious faith. And in place of the faith and congressional supremacy established by intermediary institutions that characterize both the old right and the entrenched managerial class, The new right will favor populist-based presidency, able to cut through the present oligarchical establishment and promote new intermediary institutions centered on middle America. Not a lot of that exists these days, at least the intermediary institutions. We didn't create Gibbs for our guys. But I mean, what he's saying is we need to create patronage. The conflict into which the new right is entering is a complex one. Because of its complexity, the political expression of Mars cannot take forms that are entirely consistent in ideology or are calculated to please everyone within its own ranks. Because of the issues and values are real and not the product of abstract cerebration, there will be, and there will probably be, no monolithic movement under the new right aegis. Which is true. I mean, yeah. Even now, you look at the quote unquote new right of today, there is no monolithic movement. There are a million different ideas, factions, writers, essayists, people that want to preserve old America, who want to go back to 1776. Others want to be step warriors. Others wish to see a monarchy, a corporate CEO. I mean, anything that you can find in your like factions of like internet politics, they're all here, and they're all actually being discussed by staffers on Capitol Hill. There were a few staffers that and congressmen that our friend Mr. Jeremy Carl had met with not too long ago in Washington D.C., who knew about the book through my interview with him. So I mean, some of this exists. These ideas are being discussed. They are being discussed by even worse people that tend to work either in Congress or in political think tanks and institutions. You know who else is thinking about, like the border? The Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation. Bone chilling. Bone chilling. There will be a coalition that will often find itself split, and the opponents of the new right will, of course, seek to take advantage of these splits. They do. To quote that lit song, we are our own worst enemy. Hence, the political movement requires, more than is customary in American political history, a discipline, a leadership, and a formula that will promote its cohesion and electoral advantages and its objectives. I guess for the leadership, it will probably be the Trump campaign in this day and age, even though I don't know how effective that is, and we've already been hurt before. But also that we have to consider, I think we are less disciplined now than we were 40 years ago. And as for cohesion, well, the internet's a good example. The online fighting is a great example of that. We saw how well, quote unquote, uniting the right went. But also, even in, say, more, I guess, firebrand forms of conservatism in the GOP establishment, always being exploited by its establishment forces. The late Carroll Quigley argued that new civilizations form themselves around dynamic, innovative social forces, which he called instruments. As these instruments develop, they acquire vested interests that retard their dynamism and slow their innovative capacities. These instruments then become ossified institutions that oppose the rise of new forces, unless challenged, lead to civilizational decay. The managerial elite described in this essay began its history as an instrument that is now on the stage of what Quigley would call institutionalization. In its youth, it was a force for much innovation, expansion, and cultural dynamism. In its essence, it is a force only for itself in the cultivation of self-indulgence, both material and psychological. Its power being challenged by a new force, but also described above. If victorious, no doubt the Mars themselves will exploit their rivals and, like all men, have much to answer for. So does the Reagan group as well. No doubt also the new elite that they will form will someday degenerate and itself be challenged by new dynamic forces. But the choice between the present elite and its challenges is not merely between one power and another. It is a choice between degeneration and rebirth, between death and survival. For survival that is not a right or a gift freely granted by powers that be. Survival in the jungle or in political societies is a hard-won prize that depends ultimately on power itself. In this world, wrote Goethe, one must be the hammer or the anvil. The essential message for the essence of the message from Mars is that the messengers want to work the forge. There's Sam Francis's message from Mars. I guess I'll go read chat and say hello to the super chats while I'm here in between essays. But yeah, you can take a look at some of these. What are the evolution of civilizations? An introduction to historical analysis. There you go, Carol Quigley. I have not read any Carol Quickly, and I've been told I should, so I may have to get that further down the line. uh, Belial Bradley says, gauche. And it's definitely true. Glow in the Dark says, we didn't just follow old mistakes, we dived headfirst into them. Although we didn't fall into every mistake, a real way forward is to remember it and pass it on to the next generation until victory. Well, that's definitely true. I should not, I should not, potentially, I shouldn't be as black pilled as others are. Well, I try not to, I'm also not overly optimistic, but I know that these are long conflicts, obviously. Glow in the Dark says, it seems old right estimations were wrong as they misunderstood the reach of the liberal machine into culture and academia. They understood its methodology well, but they seem to lack knowledge of how it affected people's perceptions or cultural change. I think we have a better idea of that now just because of how mass media works. For instance, in one of these essays, I think it's Richard Figueres, he'll talk about disintermediation, right? And he'll talk about pamphlets and mailers to bypass um, the mainstream press and the radio and TV. If I can just mail it to you directly, then I can speak clearly to the American people, especially in swing states, to get the message across in elections. And he talks about how that works. And in the same way, disintermediation works today with social media and social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, blogging, Substack, etc. But also, we have to be well aware of the fact that all it takes is a little pressure from certain institutions to basically get people kicked off. Lest we forget, I'm pretty sure it was an SPLC writer or I think yeah, it was an SPLC writer who simply just said, I think for the Guardian or even the SPLC page itself, that Patrick Casey was on YouTube again, making money off super chats, and he didn't make a lot of money off super chats, but they still got his channel, which had about 10,000 plus subscribers, instantly deplatformed with no likelihood of coming back. Because unless you own that institution, unless you own YouTube, and unless you kick out the Indians in YouTube, like Rasha Mohan and the rest, you're never going to be able to get that back. Like, you're just not. Um, that's just definitely the case. So, I mean, like, this is why I think people get very excited, even though he's kind of a Redditor. I just want my heckin' Babylon Bee. But I mean, this is why Elon Musk is a big deal. For the first time, there is someone in these institutions that can kind of say, no, I won't play ball that way. The fact that it took the world's richest man and the world's biggest Redditor to do it is a pretty damnable offense on our part. But it does indicate that there's some extent that we know these things. And he also showed us that you can fire 80% of those people and company still works. Seneca again says that Sam Francis essays kind of dampened my spirits. We've repeated the same mistakes of the new right. Well, he's talking about creating a formula. I don't know how many of these mistakes we've repeated. I guess the question is going to be whether or not what happens in this election and what happens with this burgeoning class of people that comes about will change anything. But it reminds me of some Catholic theology. The punishment for sin is usually more sin. The only way out is through. Yeah, the only way out is through. That I would guarantee is a for sure thing there in that respect. That would definitely be the case. So that is the Sam Francis essay. We're going to carry on to probably another, and then we'll go there. He sounds happy. Well, yeah, Sam Francis is probably a little more cheerful in this instance than many of us probably were today. That is for sure. But let me go up, and let's see what's the next essay. Lid on a boiling pot. Oh, that's don't know what that one's actually about. But someone suggested earlier that we read the ones about the judiciary. So that's probably one that I'm very interested in taking a look at. So let's look at the judiciary. Wonder which one that was on. Judicial Supremacy. That was William Stanmeyer. So let's go 168. See how close I get to that. Ah, cool. Perfect. Judicial Supremacy. I skipped ahead. All right, so this will probably be the last essay I read for the night. I still have to go to work in the morning, but I'm going to quickly pop in my medication. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, your lovely dollars over on subscribestar.com/theprudentialist pay for that. You guys make sure I don't pay anything out of pocket for my medication. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. I mean, I have good insurance and things like that, but still, everything that you guys do, it goes back into either the show or keeping me afloat and sane. I don't milk that parasocial very much, but I am incredibly grateful for the fact that I've been doing this for almost 4 years. And the where I've been, who I've met, what I've seen, the people I've met from from these conferences and such, there are no words to describe my gratitude. And I don't know how long I'm going to be doing this, whether it's another 4 years, another 10, or if I get picked up somewhere or I retire somewhere, who knows? Um, I will not, I will always be grateful. The fact I've met you all and do all this, truly a great gift. Alrighty. Nope. TB88 says, funny to think about the names that we know from those versus those that we've forgotten. So much of the right has been memory hold or canceled. Hope the icons turn out good. Cheers. Well, thank you, TB. It will be a 6 day workshop. So when I leave, it will be finished. So I will share it on Twitter and on my community tab here on YouTube when I'm done with it. Should start boomer posting and get a blaze kick. No. Um, but yeah, no. We'll see. If God wills me to do that, EL, then that's what God wills. It's not up to me. But yeah, we'll carry on. So this is Judicial Supremacy by William A. Stanmeyer. The rise of judicial rule means the decline of government by consent. To put the situation in historical perspective, one must remember that an early act of the New Deal was to restrict federal court jurisdiction. The Dred Scott decision was reversed only by the Civil War. Formerly a college instructor in ethics and political theory, law professor Stanmeyer has taught jurisprudence and constitutional law at Georgetown Law Center and Indiana University School of Law, and has written widely on church/state and other First Amendment questions. Presently, he directs the Delaware Law School Government Law Program. Who watches the Watchmen? For myself, it would be most irksome to be ruled by a bevy of platonic guardians, even if I knew not how to choose them, which I assuredly do not. Judge Learned Hand, the Bill of Rights. A revolution in the process of governing America has occurred. To some, this revolution portends a coming millennium of equality, fairness, and liberty. That chiliastic notion of progressivism. To others, this revolution portends an increase in arbitrariness, confusion, and administration of schools and prisons, and in the distribution of public services, and of growing rule by an oligarchic elite coupled with a growing frustration on that part of an impotent electorate. But whatever it portends, that a revolution in the governance has taken place is a fact no longer seriously controverted. For the ultimate legislative power has passed generally to the federal judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court. Even the defenders of this transfer admit as much. The United States Supreme Court now sits as the ultimate legislature in the country. It sits as well as the continuing council of revision of the Constitution. Therefore, it is a body of men who are under no rule but their own will. If somehow its 9 members could be compressed into one person, we would behold the functional equivalent of a king, and the unrestricted judicial power the court wields would be called, as it was in the 17th century, the divine right of kings. This conclusion is not original. On the contrary, it has become the continuing theme of a sizable group of scholars of whom one could hardly stigmatize as being conservative in any but the most elemental classical sense, these desiring to conserve whatever is perennial and valuable in past socio-political arrangements. Many of these writers are, in terms of the issues that agitate Congress and the electorate, largely liberal in its orientation, still are profoundly disquieted by the ominous concentration of power in the hands of unelected officials with lifetime tenure. A lengthy compilation of their names and writings would unduly extend these remarks, so I will only mention a few. Thus, Adolph A. Burrell, a Franklin Roosevelt appointee to the State Department, later a distinguished law professor, states candidly, the thesis can be briefly stated. Ultimate legislative power in the United States has come to rest in the Supreme Court of the United States. This is still true today. If you want the most honest 5 minutes of American politics, I've said this elsewhere, and I'm going to say it again. If you want the most honest 5 minutes of American politics, you will find the then senator from Nebraska, Ben Sass, at the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in 2017, 2018, 2017, saying outright that the Supreme Court is the politics of last resort in America because Congress has effectively given up its power to the bureaucracies. And so when America has a cultural or a legal battle, it goes to the courts. It does not go to Congress. It does not go. It goes to the courts. And ultimately, the Supreme Court is the politics of last resort for the American people, and all cultural battles are fought there. Again, law professor Louis Lucky acknowledges quite openly that the Supreme Court is, quote, ready to engage in freehand constitution making, end quote, in a way that he shortly says betokens the deliberate determination to impose on the nation the will of 7 men who have not been elected by the people. And the Harvard emeritus professor Raoul Berger, the author of the landmark studies on the limits of executive privilege on the constitutional problems of impeachment, opens his attack on judicial usurpation tellingly titled Government by Judiciary, with a matter-of-fact observation that, quote, the 14th Amendment is the case study par excellence of what Justice Harlan described as the Supreme Court's exercise of amending power, its continuing revision of the Constitution under the guise of interpretation, emphasis added. And he closes his study with a peroration that the nation should not tolerate the spectacle of a court that pretends to apply constitutional mandates while in fact revising them in accordance with the preference of the majority of the justices who seek to impose their will on the nation. End quote. Striking the same theme, Erwin Griswold, former dean of Harvard Law School, commented in 1976, quote, the Supreme Court justices employ their ruse of saying what we are doing is interpreting the Constitution, when what the court is doing is deciding what is good for the country. End quote. The works of the judicial rulers. I am somewhat embarrassed to take the reader's time with the foregoing comments, so commonplace that has their thesis become, but old biases die hard and some may never quite fade away. Isn't that definitely true? As children, we learned in civics class that the United States, the states united, the nation's federal government, was the creation of practical political philosophers who profoundly distrusted the centralization of power. Having their fill of King George, they were determined to never again would Americans suffer the rule of royalty, who were unelected officials with lifetime tenure. We learned further that the separation of powers meant that the federal government was divided into 3 distinct and equal, quote, branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, and that each had their own particular function. Of that, the judicial being to interpret the laws and on rare occasion clarify what the unchanging Constitution meant. The naive gullibility of children, we also took it for granted that the national legislature made laws and that we, the people, would never be required to do something we did not like, unless that something had the approval of the majority of our elected representatives. We did not learn much about the Supreme Court except some thoughts out of Marbury versus Madison, of which all we could remember as adults were that somehow the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, which meant that when necessity called it, justices would lay the statute next to the Constitution to see if it fit. And if not, like Taylor altering a baggy suit, they would order that the offensive segment be cut out, declared unconstitutional. The purpose of this complicated tripartite government understood as checks and balances, because, as Lord Acton was to put it later, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Consequently, each branch had their own check and balance on others. But reminiscent of Orwell's remark in Animal Farm that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, one of the co-equal of the 3 branches, the Supreme Court, has taken it upon itself to check and balance the other 2 branches far more aggressively than they have checked it. A brief and partial list of judicial policymaking would remind us how extraordinary it has been the revolution the court has achieved before our very noses. It has been a veritable coup. Since 1960, the Supreme Court has 1. Restructured state and local governments through its reappointment rulings, radically transformed state criminal procedures, substantially restricted the states from using the death penalty, written a national regulatory code permitting abortion on demand, despite popular plebiscites on the issues in such states as Michigan and Nebraska voting for abortion restrictions consonant with over 100 years of American history, invented a constitutional right of privacy without a majority even agreeing on the constitutional text which to base this new right, approved and even required the use of compulsory cross district busing to achieve racial balance in private schools, come within an inch of legalizing hardcore pornography and prevented any state control over offensive sexual material that is not quite hardcore, expelled prayer and Bible reading from public schools, making the public schools institutionally secular humanist, virtually destroyed congressional attempts at protecting the nation's internal security, and destroyed almost all state efforts to provide some financial relief to their parents of children in private school. All these culture war battles, minus maybe one or two of these, have been unchallenged and unchanged. Death penalty is still allowed, although it's substantially restricted. The Miranda stuff, um, reappointment rulings, and then, of course, the court upholding various parts of the Civil Rights Act when it comes to congressional rulings, privacy, Griswold v. Connecticut, and so on and so forth. And this is even before the worst other cases come along that only accelerate these declines in social degeneracy. This partial enumeration is extraordinary. Over the years, the Supreme Court has variously replaced state legislatures, hospital governing boards, public school boards, and thousands of parents, state censorship authorities, and the U.S. Congress itself. Over the years, its 9 unelected officials with lifetime tenure have claimed an expertise superior to that of the American people, their elected representatives in state legislatures, and the U.S. Congress itself, in such a wildly diverse matters as political districting, balancing the rights of defendants and victims, deciding how frequently and if at all legislatures may protect the people by imposing death for heinous crimes, deciding when life begins. The court says it cannot, but it did not quote any modern gynecologists or physiologists who have been able to decide since at least 1857. Protecting public morality or encouraging religion in schools. And at the writing of this, the court has a pending case whether a 3-judge district court in 1980 held unconstitutional the draft registrations requirement imposed on men, but not on women. Remember hashtag draft our daughters? That was fun. Saying that these judges may tell U.S. Congress and the National Defense Department who may be drafted and how the nation must compose an effective fighting force despite 200 years of contrary history, the fact that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause dealt with race and not sex, and the text of the Constitution itself. With such an imperial judiciary, surely one must warrant to recall and slightly paraphrase the remark made by Cassius to Marcus Brutus. Now in all the names all the gods at once, upon what mate to these our Caesars feed, that they are grown so great. Of good ends and of questionable means. Like Caesar, our judicial rulers are not without their virtues. A fair-minded critic should admit that sometimes they have indeed done justice. Indeed, it is frequently observed that the court has to take on the role of a policeman or conscience, or in the idealistic eyes of some, schoolmaster. For the rest of us, it is said that where the manifest wrong exists, neither Congress nor, quote, the people will correct it. The Supreme Court must act. A bit profanely, this may be called the lifeguard theory of judicial activism. Some person or group is thrashing around helplessly in the pounding legislative surf. The many political onlookers stand on shore passive and impassive. Only the lifeguard has the courage to plunge into the water to rescue. An example of judicial lifeguard theory is Brown v. Board of Education, which held the law imposed school segregation as unconstitutional. I happen to believe that Brown was an absolutely correct decision, though weak in its theoretical rationale. A second example is sometimes given in the first reappointment case, Baker v. Carr, although here the court departed from its custom of judicial restraint in matters characterized as a political question. The court obtained, quote, good results, it will be said, and consequently we should not be overly concerned with how it got them. The court concerns emerging social values. And because no other institution has the will to act, must drag the legislatures and the people kicking and screaming, perhaps into conformity with those values. What the court's Brown decision did in the area of racial segregation in schools, at last grudgingly admitted to be right by all factions of society except the most extreme, the court can do in any other area, whether it be by the role of religion, the rules on abortion, or the running of the army. The thesis that results are more important than process, and the ends are more important than means, or that good results validate the bad process, even as some in ethical code, good ends justify bad means, is a thesis that should be strange and uncomfortable on the lips of lawyers. For the history of the Anglo-American law is to a large degree a history of due process. The gradual development of standards of procedure, the integrity of which is even more important over the long haul than getting the quote right result in a given case by bending the rules a little or a lot. Similarly, the thesis that some appointed group of guardians has, like mystical oracles of ancient Rome, a deeper insight into the life of true meaning, and has the laws and powers of prophecy not bestowed on us ordinary citizens, is also a thesis that should make lawyers uncomfortable. Whence does the court derive this power to discern emerging social values, i.e., progressivism? How does the court know which values are emerging, usually by loud subversive elements? How can it tell when the values have emerged, when there is a sufficient Schelling point in public opinion? Far enough to warrant discovery, i.e., writing into the Constitution. During the last few years, for instance, was it possible to discern whether Jerry Falwell or Hugh Hefner's values were emerging faster? What is it about the process of fact finding used by courts that give judges more accurate, intuitive feel for emerging values than the perceptions of, say, state legislatures or of the Congress? Often, defenders of judicial activism boast that their courts are above the political process, as though they have asserted that gave them as much wisdom as it gives them independence. Really, however, they are in a dilemma. Either the Supreme Court, and to a considerable degree the activist federal courts following the Supreme Court's lead, are indeed political bodies. They read the election returns, in which case we should drop the pretense of detachment of dispassionate objectivity, or whether they are truly above the earthly world of political compromise and maneuver, in which case, being truly out of touch, they can hardly have any more grasp on the social moral trends than a monk in a Trappist monastery, and surely have far less grasp than the elected members of legislatures. Basically saying, just take the mask off, bro. Just take the mask off. Please, oh please, just let us be legislatures at that point, is really what it would be. That's really how it should be in that case. I think it's important to consider that. But yeah, things to consider here. These are things that we know for sure. But indeed, the court has been one of the most transformative social means and has dragged everyone else into what has already been planned. And this is the thing about progressive activism is that almost every major progressive court victory had been strategically planned. It was planned by political activists, lawyers, certain claimants, and certain respondents and defendants were picked over others. Famously, you know this with Rosa Parks and the rest. But the problem is deeper than mere result oriented jurisprudence and more interested in ends than means. The problem is also one of implausible rationales for decisions, which rationales later break loose from their factual moorings and drift, like some errant hot air balloon, into foreign fields where they do not belong. I will demonstrate this point with some examples below, but here the serious reader might undertake a preliminary intellectual exercise. He should ask himself of what extent the American people would accept the Supreme Court's social rulings if the court lacked the power to insist on enforcement and had to rely solely on the intrinsic persuasiveness of its reasoning. Put another way, if the Supreme Court had only an advisory role on which it could declare an act of Congress unconstitutional but could not invalidate that act unless Congress itself chose to accept the court's position and vote to repeal the act, then the court would indeed be the conscience too, but not the substitute for the other branches of government. But it would be a conscience on whose claims to guide Congress, the president, and the people would rest solely on its moral authority, the clarity of its analysis, the accuracy of its historical research, and the logic of its ratiocination, the power of its thought. I do not say that this should be the court's only role. I do say many times that Congress and the people have acquiesced in the court's decisions. The Supreme Court has spoken because they believed there was nothing else they could do, not because the court in any way convinced them in its directives compelled by the Constitution. The court had to rely on persuasion alone and not on power. One suspects that it would venture more cautiously into fewer areas of controversy when it did, and when it did it, it would only compose opinions of such unchallengeable good sense that scarcely anyone would disagree. That, the whole Supreme Court is spoken thing. I mean, this relies heavily on the what's the word I'm looking for? It relies heavily on the acceptance that you need that you have to accept the legitimacy of the institutions themselves, and that's certainly the case that you have to deal with here. To return to the problem of implausible rationales which break loose from their fractural mourning, hey, there's Griswold v. Connecticut. In Griswold v. Connecticut, the majority of the court groped for a coherent reason to find the unconstitutional Connecticut laws, making it a misdemeanor to counsel or assist in using of contraceptives. A plurality led by Justice Douglas discovered that specific guarantees of the Bill of Rights have penumbras formed by emanations from those guarantees to help give them life and substance. He argued that various guarantees create zones of privacy and concluded with a powerful encomium to marriage as a relationship having a right to privacy older than the Bill of Rights, even. Other justices found the basis for the rights of privacy to be in the Ninth Amendment, and on others in the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, in which the court had long felt authorized to read substantive rights, even though the text and history make it plain that procedural rights were intended. But whatever the rationale, when the court's ink dried on Griswold, the right of marital privacy was written into the Constitution. Confined in the institution of marriage, the new right of privacy may not have done much mischief, but virtually the first chance to hack away at the mooring ropes, the Supreme Court cut out the very basis for the right, the marriage relationship, and applied it to strike down a law prohibiting the distribution of contraceptives to an unmarried person. Thus, in Einstadt versus Bard, when Mr. Justice Brennan denied the distinctiveness of marriage relation, if the right to privacy means anything, it is the right of an individual, married or single, to be freed from unwarranted government intrusions onto manners so fundamentally affecting a person as the decision whether to bear or beget a child. The court's philosophical legerdemain has evoked considerable comment. Thus, Professor Gerald Gunther, the author of one of the most widely adopted constitutional law texts, remarked, quote, what is clear in Griswold is that all the justices in the majority found some ordering of constitutional values justified. Some fundamental values deserve special protection. That consensus poses a common question to all of modern substantive due process cases. How does the court determine the proper place for a particular right on the hierarchy of values? What are the proper sources and fundamental values in constitutional adjudication? End quote. Einstadt, convenient name, conveniently set the stage for Roe v. Wade, which legalized, for all practical purposes, abortion on demand. And hey, do you want to go back to a really old prude video? You want to go back almost 4 years ago? I got a video on the slippery slope where I'm talking about this exact issue, and I had not even read this essay or this book yet. About a 4-year-old video. Pretty sure it's got less than 1,000 views. I've also done a show about the slippery slope with Orrin McIntyre on this exact issue. The court, through Mr. Justice Blackmun, explained that the right of privacy, wherever in the Constitution it can be be found, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Later, he stated that Texas may not, by adopting one theory of life, override the rights of pregnant women that are at stake. On this passage, Professor Gunther asks rhetorical questions. Why should not a lack of consensus lead the court to defer to rather than invalidate the state's judgment? Can the court's judgment be supported by anything other than a judicial authority infusing a particular set of moral values into the Constitution? However, one answers these questions, he must surely pause when he sees the next field to which the windows of ideology will blow unmoored the right of privacy. In a 5-4 decision, Planned Parenthood of Missouri versus Danforth, the court invalidated a provision requiring an unmarried woman under 18 to obtain the consent of parents or a person in loco parentis as a prerequisite of obtaining an abortion in most circumstances. In passing, Justice Blackmun articulated a statist philosophy of rights. The state does not have the constitutional authority to give a third party absolute veto over the decision of the physician and his patient to terminate the patient's pregnancy. So in a mere 10 years, we jump from the constitutional right of married adults to obtain contraceptions to the constitutional right of an unmarried minor to procure an abortion. Quite the leap. Again, the slippery slope, undefeated champion. In other areas as well, the courts indulged in their processes of discovering a right in particular facts, expanding it beyond those facts in other areas, increasingly remote, and by dropping all pretense of using analogy or precedent by applying the new right to a completely different situation, one in where it would never have dared to discern it de novo. Thus, after the Brown case in 1954, the court naturally wanted to strike down racial segregation in public schools in D.C. I have no quarrel with the result. I agree with Justice Warren's observation Then, in the view of that, the Constitution prohibits states from making racially segregated public schools. It would have been unthinkable that the same Constitution would impose a lesser duty on the federal government. That is a whole other case to discuss at a later time. I'm going to try my best to avoid being spicy and staying on YouTube. Because definitely the busing thing that would follow afterwards has been a disaster. And schools are still effectively segregated nowadays, just along economic and racial lines. It's almost as if these things have done nothing except waste trillions of dollars of American taxpayer money on doing things that are impossible. But to get this good result, the court had played the old sleight of hand trick again. It held that segregated DC public schools violated the due process of the Fifth Amendment. More precisely, that they violated the equal protection component of this clause. But the difficulty of this view is fundamental. The due process clause of the Fifth Amendment deals, as the context makes clear, with criminal procedure, and in any event simply does not have an equal protection component. The court got a good result by reading a new phrase into the Constitution, amending it, and then interpreting the phrase which had been inserted into the document. Many years later, the court's invention, much like the Frankenstein monster which broke loose from the laboratory table and lurched out to terrorize the townsfolk, came back to haunt it in Fully Love versus Kletznick. The question whether Congress could so structure a spending program that 10% of federal funds granted for local public works projects must be used by a state or local grantee to procure services or supplies from, quote, minority enterprises. This affirmative action type of program was attacked as reverse discrimination. In upholding the plan, the court found it had to circumvent its own creation. In the words of Chief Justice Berger, writing for himself and two other justices, we must go on to decide whether the limited use of racial and ethnic criteria is a constitutionally permissible means for achieving the congressional objectives does not violate the equal protection component of the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment. And again, you still are supposed to, with federal dollars, try and procure, minority or small business or female-owned businesses. You get extra points that way when putting out RFPs and things with federal dollars. And again, if you live in areas like I do, that you're not going to find that. You just won't. And then it gets reported, and that helps with appropriations and budgets. It's a real pain. Real pain. Carrying on. The court decided to uphold the instant program probably. The court decided to uphold the instant program probably does not trouble most people. Indeed, probably not one person in 100 has ever heard of the program or the case. But there are other areas where the court's floating jurisprudence is immensely troubling. Perhaps the most obvious area is the compulsory busing of grammar and high school students to achieve racial balance. This is perhaps the classic instance of the theory run amok. In a nutshell, the court stated that with a good principle, namely the assignment of students to schools on the basis of race violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This is the core upholding of Brown v. Board of Education. At that time, the court focused on the process of assignment and not the results. At the time of Brown and shortly thereafter, courts could state that the Constitution does not require integration and merely forbids segregation. But in a case of 1968, Green versus County School Board, the court focused on the effects rather than the purpose and good faith of desegregation efforts and held that a unified or racially non-discriminatory, in fact, school system must be effectuated. The court then approved even cross-district busing in Swan, 1971, giving the green light for activist federal judges to push for virtual, if not actual, racial quotas to achieve them by all things, assignment of students on schools to the basis of race, the very principle the justices had struck down in Brown versus Board. I will not tarry here to note that the utter lack of popular support or the massive busing that judges have ordered, nor will I take the reader's time discussing the uselessness of all of it from the educational standpoint. Nor will I more than mention the massive busing has contributed to white flight and thus harmed the cause of racial harmony and integration. Clearly, it did not work, and clearly, I don't think it can. Rather, I will mention only. It's not even that I don't think it can. It's just I know that it won't. All forms of diversity decrease public participation, civic trust, high trust, and decreased participation in democratic institutions, leads to activism, and leads to racial democratic coalitions. Like we just know this already. Like 40 years later, we know this. And all the people who were against Brown and those that legally fought against it probably knew it as well. But okay, Stanmeyer. Okay. Rather, I will mention the only jurisprudential fact. Too often the court's opinions lack coherent principle, and too often the courts takes what principle it does have, and in its eagerness to remake society along its own ideas of what is right, misapplies it out of context. The result in that many controversial areas, the court's opinions do not simply persuade. One only gets the feeling that its opinions are afterthoughts tacked onto a ruling to give the impression of reasoning from accepted premises to necessary conclusions, whereas in reality, they are no more than fancy clothes in which to grab royal edicts. We'll check super chats again. Um, Gregory sends $9. He says, "I'm enjoying this. That's all." Well, that's certainly true. Well, I appreciate that. And our other one comes from Brent Taylor. As the red day is dawning and the lightning cracks the sky, they'll raise their hands to the heavens with above resentment in their eyes. Less than 100 days. I We'll see. We'll see, Mr. Taylor. I'm I'm not I will say this. I'm not black pilled, but you should be prepared for the worst. And that means you have less than 100 days to prepare for the worst. And one should act accordingly that they have 100 less than 100 days to prepare for the worst. And that includes you, by the way. That includes you, I think, as well. So important to consider. Keeping the republic, every citizen's duty. Yeah, if only. If only. A republic, if you can keep it, as Ben Franklin said. When asked to contribute an essay to this book, I found myself feeling some misgivings about the title. For it seems to me that the problem of judicial supremacy completely transcends the categories of new right or new left or whatever. I do not care to demean the discussion by flippant use of a convenient slogans or groupings. The problems I have tried to sketch is the central problem of our political society. The problem is no less than how to answer the question, who shall govern? Who shall make the rules for all of us? Our founding fathers had a very clear answer to this question. Our elected representatives shall govern. For a considerable period in the second third of this century, the court has been preventing our elected representatives from both governing in socio-moral matters and the way that they want. I would think that both the right and left would see how deep lies the difficulty that would set aside the rhetoric and anathema and distrust to make common cause in seeking a remedy. Oh, that feels so naive. So naive. For pendulums do swing. Well, they do, but not so much these days. Though it is largely the conservatives who today decry the court's usurpations, with the appointment by a new president and a few conservative justices, it may well be the liberals who tomorrow decry the court's usurpations. That's definitely true. Biden's trying to pack the court, or his administration. It's not like Biden has real power. Important as many of the substantive issues that this paper has used to illustrate the activity of the imperial judiciary, they pale into insignificance when the full enormity of our situation comes home. An ostensible republic with the forms of democratic institutions and most important matters governed by unelected judges with lifetime tenure. The Revolutionary War was fought to achieve self-government. Unbridled judicial review claims the power to take it away. It is ironic that the Warren Court's insistence that one man, one vote rule of districting and the reapportionment cases came from the same court which felt no inhibition in striking down wholesale the enactments of legislatures and congresses whenever those ones put representatives in who did not share the court's social philosophy. One begins to wonder what use elections are if courts can so freely set aside the laws officials seek to enact. Oh, ain't that the case, Mr. Stanmeyer? Professor Graglia has noted the problem quite trenchantly. Under the unique system of the American government, a victory at the polls remains a victory only so long as it is not disproved by the courts, a function performed in some other systems by the military. Ain't that the case? Ain't that the truth? That is definitely true in that regard. And that's just definitely the case. So I urge my colleagues, friends, and fellow lawyers on both the left and the right to set aside denominational feuding on this issue. Procedure is important. It is, because it's got to manipulate procedural outcomes to get a desired result. So yes, procedure is incredibly important. Procedure and political formula all boils down to a lot of procedural aspects of how things get done. Persuasive rationales for decisions are necessary. We are talking about the government of a free, literate, and fairly sophisticated adult people, not a kindergarten. Well, not so much these days, demographically. We must find ways to ensure that courts are responsive to the people, for it is we, the people, who have formed government and whom the Constitution entrusts power to amend. Indeed, very old timey classical liberal in this sense. I believe that whatever one's political philosophy, left or right, he should be able to agree that the courts have taken over the legislative powers through three steps. One, the creation of unrestricted judicial review. The facile claim of vague constitutional clause written decades ago, due process, equal protection, not only prevents Congress from doing X, but sometimes even mandates that it does Y. And three, the reliance of the mystic prestige of the Supreme Court on Americans' traditional respect for law, plus the fact Congress has not yet limited in any serious way the power of judicial review. Still hasn't. The reasons Congress has not acted include these. One, myopia. Congress and other affected groups do not fully realize this is a radical structural flaw in our entire system of Republican government. Two, some solutions are too extreme, e.g., impeaching a given judge. I don't think that's extreme. Three, resistance to judicial imperialism has been aimed at specific isolated issues. School prayer, racial busing, and necessary coalitions have not been built. Four, there has been no schematized scholarly source of principled analysis of the generic problem along with a comprehensive spectrum of practical proposals for reform. That last one I think was probably true for the time. I think there's been plenty written, and there's a lot of literature that would tell us that we could probably fix judicial activism. Were they with us today, some of the nation's greatest presidents, such as Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln, would certainly join in the effort to devise institutional limitations on the court's power. For the record, I offer some of their remarks, which commonly appear in law school casebooks. Quote, but the opinion which gives the judges the right to decide on what laws are constitutional and what not only for themselves in their own sphere of action, but for the legislature and executive also in their spheres, would make the judiciary a despotic branch. Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Abigail Adams, September 11th, 1804. Interesting year there, Mr. Jefferson. Marbury versus Madison's also decided that year. You seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions, a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal, knowing that to whatever hands confided with the corruptions of the time and party, its members would become despots. It has more wisely made all departments co-equal and co-sovereign with themselves. Thomas Jefferson to William C. Jarvis, September 28th, 1820. It is the opinion of the judges that has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges, and to the point that the president is independent of both. The authority of the Supreme Court must not, therefore, be permitted to control Congress or the executive when acting in their legislative capacities, but to have such influence as force of reasoning the reasoning they may deserve. Andrew Jackson, veto message on the bill to recharter the Bank of the United States, July 10th, 1832. I did not forget the position assumed by some that the constitutional questions are decided by the Supreme Court, nor do I deny that such decisions must be binding in any case upon the parties to a suit as to the object of that suit, while they are also entitled to a very high respect and consideration in all parallel cases by other departments and of the government. And while it is obviously possible that such a decision may be erroneous in any given case, still the evil effect following it being limited to that particular case with a chance that it may be overruled and never again become precedent for other cases can be better be borne than could the evils of a different practice. At the same time, the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon the vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the instance they are made in ordinary litigation between parties and personal actions, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers and having to that extent resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. Abraham Lincoln, First Inaugural Address, March 4th, 1861. Emphasis added. The limits of judicial review. In Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton attempts a principal justification of judicial review. He urges that the judiciary form the nature of its functions will always be the least dangerous to the political right of the Constitution, because it will be in the least capacity to annoy or injury them. He states that unlike the executive, who holds the sword of the community, and the legislature, which controls the purse and makes the rules, courts do not have force nor will, but merely judgment. Rather, he makes fundamental law argument. The Constitution is fundamental, and all laws, ordinary legislative acts, which conflict with it, are void. This means whenever a particular statute contravenes the Constitution, It will be the duty of the judicial tribunals to adhere to the latter and disregard the former. For the Constitution ought to be preferred to the statute, the intention of the people to the intention of their agents. Later in this essay, Hamilton grapples with the problem of possible unconstitutional acts by the judiciary itself. He seems to realize that if Congress and the president are creatures of the Constitution, so is the court. But if we give the court the power to declare what the Constitution means, we give the court power to be the judge in its own case, to create itself, as it were. The question then becomes, what limits do we put on the court? And even as it puts limits on the other two branches, who watches the watchman? The court, Hamilton tells us, may nullify acts of Congress when the latter violate specific constitutional prohibitions. For example, passing an ex post facto law or bill of attainder, or where it passes acts contrary to the manifest tenor of the Constitution. Manifest must mean obvious, clear, and undisputed. Again, Hamilton remarks that in ascertaining the meaning of the Constitution, as with any fundamental law, the judges must ascertain the meaning of any particular act proceeding from the legislature. If there should happen that there be an irreconcilable variance between the two, the Constitution is to be preferred. Irreconcilable suggests that only the cases where no man could find a way to reconcile the statute and the Constitution. Otherwise, an ordinary variance that can be harmonized by a skillful interpretation of either statute or Constitution would not warrant striking down a congressional act. Finally, Hamilton urges that judges should be bound down by strict rules and precedents, which serve to define and point out their duty in every particular case that comes before them. It should be apparent that if judges follow strict rules and precedents, they will not come up with bizarre interpretations or vague phrases or reverse meanings in their own prior decisions. This is a considerable question, however, whether even this version of highly self-restrained and limited judicial review reflected in the desire of the Founding Fathers. Hamilton was eager to see the new republic adopt an aristocratic form of government. His plan, which he presented to the Philadelphia Convention, provided for a president elected for life, for senators with life terms, and a reduction of the states to mere administrative arms of the national government by having the president appoint state governors for life and to give unto them veto to any act of state legislatures, even if unanimously passed. This extraordinary centralization was designed to defend against the interests of the propertied, financial, commercial classes. It was an aristocratic republic as opposed to a democratic republic. Obviously, it was more monarchy than a republic. As such, it received the short shrift from of the other founders. This rejection forced Hamilton to seek and provide the judiciary the powers that the other founders would not grant to the other branches, and yet he had to do it in Federalist 78 with enough qualifications, manifest tenor, irreconcilable variance, strict rules and precedents, to make its powers seem innocuous. The actual architect of the Constitution was James Madison. Madison was the philosopher-statesman who guided the convention. He believed in legislative supremacy, but felt that there needed to be some way to protect the judiciary from legislative excesses. In debates over the Council of Revision, Madison observed, quote, "It would be useful to the Judiciary Department by giving it an additional opportunity of defending itself against legislative encroachments. Experience in all the states had evinced a powerful tendency in the legislature to absorb all power into its vortex. This was a real source of danger to the American constitutions and suggested the necessity of giving every defensive authority to other departments that was consistent with Republican principles." Later, Madison enunciated the words, the thrust of which would later be expressed by Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln. But the great objection is that the legislature itself has no right to expound the Constitution, that wherever its meaning is doubtful, you must leave it to take its course until the judiciary is called upon to declare its meaning. But I beg to know upon what principle it can be contended that any one department draws from the Constitution greater powers than the other, and making out the limits and powers of several departments. The Constitution is the charter of the people and government. It specifies certain great powers and absolutely granted, and marks out the departments to exercise them. If the constitutional boundary of either be brought into question, I do not see that any one of these independent departments has more right than the other to declare their sentiments on that point. End quote. But whether one takes Hamilton's view of the self-restrained judicial review as granted in the Constitution, or Madison's view that judicial review does not reach the acts of co-equal branches, but operates only defensively, to permit the court to construe the constitutional meaning as applied to itself in cases before it, we come to the same conclusion. Since the Supreme Court and other federal courts do not even show self restraint in their own philosophical defender, Hamilton would require of them, it is time for the nation to find a way to return to the original purposes of the founding fathers and create an institutional check on the unbridled power of the courts. And again, yeah, this has not changed in the slightest, um, which is again uh, particularly damning in that respect. And none of this has changed. I mean, it's only gotten worse. Practical steps towards reform. So this will probably be the last essay I read for the night. Just as the people do not attend to police or fire protection very much until a wave of arson or burglaries breaks out in the neighborhood, so most Americans don't spend too much time on political theory. Well, unless you have a lot of free time on the internet. Life fumbles along fairly satisfactorily. Most of us do not think about theory and attend to such questions as separation of powers or the Federalist system. This disinterest may suggest how far afield the point of view of the Founding Fathers we have traveled. Nonetheless, the burdens of this essay, correct political theory, is vitally important. But not only the theory, which abstractly speaking, Americans do not understand if they do not spend much time thinking about it. Equally important is the political practice. As the quote from Abraham Lincoln noted, if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made in ordinary litigation between parties and personal actions, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. This is the situation in which they find ourselves today, and it does not matter whether sometimes the Supreme Court's decisions are correct. The issue is not so much how the goodness or badness of policy decision as how it is made. The founders meant the country to be a republic, and practice is rapidly becoming an aristocratic dictatorship. The founders meant this country to rely on its governments, on representative democracy, and in practice it is relying more and more on a judicial policy-making branch. Still is today. The founders meant for various factions and parties and all in the political arena to contend and struggle through debate and compromise to achieve legislative policies, which could be revised by further coalitions and voting patterns and further legislative sessions. When a court or set of courts, such as the district courts and then the courts of appeals and then the U.S. Supreme Court, absorb to themselves the policy-making power, that action of theirs denies all utility of long legislative and political efforts that so many people, parties, and factions entered into. It renders their activity in the electoral process nugatory, useless. Legislators are open to public comment, suggestion, and advice. One can write to one's congressman and visit him. One can organize groups support or challenge him in the next election, which invariably will occur in a short period of time. The Supreme Court, on the contrary, is not amenable to such popular commentary. Indeed, many such people feel it would be improper to write a member of the Supreme Court about one's feelings on the issue. Certainly if such an issue were before the court in litigation. Furthermore, there is grave doubt whether members of the court would read or seriously ponder any sizable amount of mail, outside of perhaps amicus curiae briefs, Therefore, members of the court are completely insulated, both institutionally and psychologically, from popular comment on their actions. Lest you accidentally leak a opinion and you have a radical leftist almost kill Brett Kavanaugh about a year or so ago with the Dobbs decision leaking. Funny how that works. Surely this reminds us of the kings and their courts in the Middle Ages, a royal elite wearing special robes and sometimes speaking a different language from the ordinary people in the fields and villages, making rule by edict, declaring and insisting and imposing and demanding, but never responding. It cannot be stressed enough that this was not the way that our founders meant it to be, nor can it be stressed enough that this system will not work over a long period of time. A bevy of Platonic guardians simply lacks the wisdom to rule a nation of over 230 million people. That means a gain of 100 million people in 40 years. Dear God, unsustainable. However, one might support the Supreme Court's decision in such extraordinary cases like Brown v. Board of Education. We must face up to the fact that the price of such decisions, if it be unrestricted judicial review, rummaging and pillaging through historical precedent and common sense, in the will-o-wisp pursuit of a perfect society, is too high to pay. The restore or balance our system simply has to be the method of institutionally checking the Supreme Court. Institutional checks and balances are the method the founding fathers hit upon to deal with the human nature and political realities they are. Hard to have checks and balances when there are very unqualified people like Sonia Sotomayor on the court. The founders carefully limited both the legislature and the presidency by numerous means of too well known to need recounting here. They also intend to check on the potentially arrogant power of the national government by delegating to it only limited authority by reserving to the states or the people remaining sizable amount of authority for daily legislative activity. Perhaps because they felt the Supreme Court was indeed the least dangerous branch, they did not carefully provide institutional limits on that court, although it is obvious from the Constitution that they felt that the judges could be impeached or that their jurisdiction could be renewed. Indeed, Article 3 of the Constitution, Section 2, Paragraph 2 states in part, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction as both to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. End quote. In any event, whether the founders thought that the impeachment or removal of jurisdiction of the Supreme Court would be used frequently or rarely, the question for us moderns, as those who support judicial activism often tell us, is how to bring the Constitution up to date. That is, how to develop constitutional principles appropriate for our modern society, which we certainly do not have, nor are we deserving of. I suggest the most important constitutional principle which we must develop is a practical institutional method to control the excesses of judicial imperialism. This means putting unrestrained judicial review on a leash. Unless we take steps to create an institution that institutional means that is firm and solid to control judicial review, all legislative struggles of various competing factions, organizations, and groups in our society can well come to naught, which is definitely the case now. I mean, all struggles now are just to pass large omnibus bills full of um, pork and slop back to people. For all that is required to overturn years of political labor is a five-man majority on the Supreme Court, reading of opaque tea leaves such as general phrases of due process and equal protection to strike down statutes which took a decade or more to enact. Moreover, what many people do not realize is that the Supreme Court is not the only source of the problem. Rather, the problem strongly emerges from lower federal courts, where a single federal judge, giving way to his social reformist desires, taking his lead by some comment for the Supreme Court, will strike out into the political thicket to cut his own path for reform, regardless of having any warrant in the Constitution for that matter, and even in an actual Supreme Court decision. Definitely the truth. We see that with local criminal and DAs, and they get away with it especially. Because they can be activists, because who has the money to go all the way to the Supreme Court when you're fighting the state? Because of this, time, cost, and the distraction of energies best spent on other matters are so great in an effort to overturn on appeal the ruling of a federal district judge. Many times, school boards, prison authorities, and community housing groups, state legislatures throw up their hands in disgust and frustration and yield to the edict of a single unelected, life tenured federal judge rather than expend the resources to try and challenge him in a higher court. Thus, what has happened to some extent was the very thing which Hamilton had recommended, that the states be ruled by an appointed officials, they themselves receiving their authority from the central government. Although Hamilton had in mind the state governors, it appears that the federal district judges in the states have taken on much of the role of what Hamilton envisioned. Now, I realize those who will read these remarks and say that although they may be interesting, they are quite beside the point. They will say that the Supreme Court's right to pass on the validity of legislation is now too much part of our constitutional system to be brought into question. They may agree that it was historical accident or bad logic or just a political power play that explained the inception of judicial review, but they will say that over 170 years have gone by and this system in force is now too late to change, and this is a conservative viewpoint in the worst possible meaning of that word. It should never be too late for a free people to change a system in which they have found has departed from their original purpose or no longer works. We changed the system of slavery, although it took the price of a civil war. We withdrew from Vietnam, although we had already committed an enormous amount of treasure to the task of staying there. We are constantly changing the racial makeup of our public school assignments, even though most cases they grow out of residential patterns that were created over a 100-year period. To say that we must continue to do so, we must continue to do the wrong way because we have always done it that way is the essence of the reactionary conservatism that enlightened people have always rejected. Yes, and then sometimes those reactionaries were right. Rather, what we must restore is the proper balance among the three branches of government and between the federal and state governments. This is what one might call revolutionary conservatism, not unlike the founding fathers of us to break loose from England in 1776 and restore the colonists the rights of Englishmen, which they had enjoyed before the depredations of King George and his henchmen. What I suggest that what we need, therefore, is a conservative revolution, which will reestablish the proper balance among our governmental branches and thereby restore the power of self governments to the American people. And you see this a lot today, this sort of revolutionary conservatism, or what gets advocated by Rufo and others, a sort of revolutionary activist conservatism, which can be good if you are willing to accept what Sam Francis was saying and totally destroy your enemies. If you don't, they will regroup and destroy you. There are a variety of practical recommendations, which I will, the various parties have made, and one can readily imagine. I will list some here with some comments. One, Congress should define the grounds of impeachment of a federal judge to include such decisions as ordering expenditures from the United States Treasury or from the state or local treasury for the specific purpose of Congress or state legislature unit. Basically, he's talking about um, federal Medicaid to pay for Medicaid for Medicaid for abortions. Basically, anything that would defy force Congress's hand on expenditures, which of course goes back to Article 1. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So that's not a half bad idea. It's a good one. Two, it's been suggested that Congress could pass a law provided that any federal or state law which is declared unconstitutional by a Supreme Court under appellate jurisdiction of the court over which Congress has full authority may be overturned by a two-thirds vote in each House of Congress within 1 year after the decision from the court. This is the thrust of H.R. 4111, which was introduced in May 1979 at the 96th Congress. I would observe that the passage of such a law would trigger a constitutional crisis, which may be a good idea so that all the cards are on the table, because the Supreme Court might assert that the reversal of finding a constitutional right in a case before the court itself is unconstitutional. However, if the thrust of the bill were stated on a constitutional amendment which Congress had properly passed and submitted to the states, and which in turn was ratified by the requisite number of states, then the people, by ratifying the amendment, would have transferred from the Supreme Court to the Congress the power to make legislative public policy. Another bill introduced in May 1979, 96th Congress, provides that any federal or state law declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which falls under the appellate jurisdiction of the court, shall require the concurrence of at least 7 justices. The thrust here is to require a supermajority so that one or another swingman on the court could not impose his will on the people without developing a substantial consensus on the court itself. While the requirement of roughly a 3/4 to enact a constitutional change is laudable and consonant with the rules of the constitutional amendments, this recommendation does not get to the essence of the problem. It still only makes it a larger oligarchy. 4, another suggestion commonly made since the time of reapportionment in school prayer cases has been the removal of Congress of controversial political and social questions from the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Indeed, Congress could go so far as to remove the decision-making from all federal courts and leave it to the hands of state courts. In my judgment, this is good, but partial answer to the problem. It is likely that Congress would not exercise this power very often, and even when it does, it is possible that the Supreme Court may attempt to subvert the congressional power to control jurisdiction. By holding that it does not have the power where constitutional rights are involved, the court will itself then declare those rights another bootstrap operation, not unlike the exercise that occurred in Marbury versus Madison. I mean, devolution would be good because governors would have more control over that. But again, it only just federalizes the problem, or defederalizes the problem. 5, some people suggest a constitutional amendment abrogating lifetime tenure of federal judges. Some of this is being discussed right now, actually, in the Biden term, although they're not doing it as a constitutional amendment, just a law. 6, envision a method enacted by constitutional amendment that abrogated the powers of judicial supremacy. This device could enable the Congress to overrule the Supreme Court or a decision of a federal district decision by, say, a 2/3 vote, or a federal district decision, say, by a majority vote of both houses, as noted above. This is very similar to what we already have existing, which would be overruling a court hearing either by constitutional amendment or by law. But you'll see. Conclusion. The Latin, who watches the watchman, asks the ultimate question, who will watch the guards themselves? If the Supreme Court justices are guardians of the Constitution, we must quickly find an institutional way to watch the guardians themselves. Otherwise, they will be a bevy of platonic guardians, responsible to no one outside of the law and above the Constitution. Certainly a more heavy legal framework essay, but certainly one nonetheless that addresses a key problem that activist judges do rule America, and that's just the God's honest truth, and that's how it is. And that's just sort of the way things are going to be, I think, going on, um, going forward from here. And yeah, I think that that's an important thing to consider. Well, with that, let me go check my other. We'll go check the comments. And we'll check super chats, and we'll go from there and call it out. We will read the rest of these papers. I'm not going to just stop here and cut it off from there. We'll read the rest. I think that this is a good series to finish up on. So we've now read. I'll scroll up to the top here, and we'll finish there. So we've read. Whoops. So we've finished reading. Um, the Message from Mars from Sam Francis. So that's one essay. And we've done Judicial Supremacy by William Stanmeyer. So there's one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight other essays to read besides the forward. So there's quite a bit to go through here. Oh, and there's two more actually. So two more essays other than that. So there's still a lot to read, and we did about 3 hours here outside of answering super chats and talking to you guys. So we'll carry on with this. I will make this probably the next live stream I do. So let's see. Next Tuesday we have the Digital Archipelago. So maybe Thursday. Well, I don't want to do it Thursday. Maybe Friday, and if not, I'll probably do it on the week I don't have the Digital Archipelago. So that may just be the 12th. We might do this on Monday, the 12th of August. Can you believe it's August already? Crazy. But yeah, we'll carry on with the series. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your donations and your support. We will continue on with this series of essays. I think that it's important for us to learn where our ideological forebears came from and how we got to where we are today. And with that, I will see you all soon.